Hi guys. Tonight, we're going to drift back in time, into a world far from the warm safety of your bed, a world soaked in secrets, cloaked in darkness, and sharpened by blades drawn in silence. This is the story of why it truly sucked to be a medieval assassin. Not the glorified hooded fantasy hero, but the real people, flesh and blood, who dared to live in the shadows. We'll walk quietly through the cobbled alleys of medieval Europe and the echoing chambers of the Middle East, peer into flickering candlelit corners where whispers of conspiracy grew, and feel the weight of death that lingered heavier than the steel in their belts. In this 24-part journey, each chapter will unravel a different layer of their cursed craft, from the harsh training, to the moral erosion, to the chilling loneliness that came from knowing no one would mourn you if you were caught. Let's begin. It always started in silence. The kind of silence that doesn't soothe, but tightens around your ribs like a slowly drawn cord. Imagine a boy, no older than 13, walking barefoot on broken ground under a moonless sky. His name doesn't matter. His name won't be remembered, not by history, not by family. That's the point. He walks to a hidden place, tucked away beneath a crumbling priory, or perhaps in the dry, suffocating vault of a forgotten fortress. A place where men who smile too little and sleep even less wait for him, not with open arms but with tests, with fire, cold steel and lies. The boy is not chosen because he's special. He's chosen because no one will miss him. An orphan, a prisoner's son, the bastard of a fallen knight, his birthright is invisibility. And in the world of the assassin, invisibility is currency. Training begins not with weapons but with starvation, with isolation, with silence. The order must break the boy before it can mold him. No attachments, no softness. They take away his name, give him a number or a colour, or sometimes nothing at all. He speaks only when told, sleeps only when allowed, eats only if he obeys. They don't teach him how to kill, at least not at first. First, they teach him how to vanish. He learns to move like water in gutters, how to fold his breath until it's thinner than mist, how to flatten his heartbeat in hiding so that even trained dogs cannot sniff him out. They teach him not to trust his eyes, but the shadows beyond them. Because the real world, this world, doesn't want to see the truth. It wants illusions. And the assassin is a master of illusions. But every illusion has a cost. By the second year, the boy, let's call him Raven, because it's what the others call him when they whisper, has not seen a real smile in months. He has been blindfolded and beaten in drills designed to teach him sensory balance. He has been locked in crypts with rats for days to cultivate stillness. He has been forced to recite poisons until he dreams in dosages. And worse still, he has been taught the softest part of the ribs to slide a blade through, taught how to make a man bleed without letting him scream, taught the dozens of ways to end a life with a gesture as small as pulling a thread on a sleeve. He has been taught not to feel. And yet, late at night, Raven still dreams of a face. A sister, maybe, or the mother he can't remember. Her face flickers like a candle almost out. When he wakes, he forgets her again. But there is no turning back. The order tightens its grip. Loyalty is no longer earned, it is expected. Punishment for hesitation is severe. One time, another recruit froze during a trial. He was told to prove his worth by severing a traitor's tongue. He wept. So they gave him a choice, cut the tongue or lose his own. He cut. They all did in the end. It's not about cruelty, that's what they say. It's about purity of purpose, about becoming more than a man, becoming a ghost, a whisper in history. They don't seek fame, for fame is a trap. A true assassin dies in obscurity, every mission a rumour, every success denied. And yet, paradoxically, their legacy must inspire terror, because fear is the greatest weapon of all. When Raven is 17, he receives his first mark. They give him a name, Sir Leontius of Berwick, a noble suspected of conspiring with the French. It is not the boy's place to know whether it is true. He must kill not from conviction, but obedience. This is the final test. He rides alone to the outskirts of Berwick, disguised as a peddler's servant. It is winter, and the fog lies low and heavy on the moors. He watches the manor from a distance for days, sleeping in mud, surviving on stale bread and melted snow. He notes the guard shifts, the pattern of torches, the quiet hour after the last bell. And then one night, just before dawn, he slips in through a collapsed section of the wall, and like mist he moves through the corridors. The only sound is the soft creak of old wood and the muted breath in his lungs. He finds the chamber. Sir Leontius is asleep, his back to the door, a dog snoring beside him. Raven's hand trembles, not from fear. Not anymore, but from something deeper, older, something the Order could not fully erase. He kneels beside the bed, unsheathes the blade and whispers, "Forgive me." He plunges the knife in cleanly, quickly, just like they taught. No screams, no struggle. The dog only lifts its head once and rests again. Raven vanishes before the household stirs. The next morning the town mourns a noble's death. Some call it illness, some whisper poison. None suspect the servant boy who once asked for a crust of bread. When Raven returns to the Order, they do not celebrate. There is no feast, no honour, only silence, and a second mark. Because that's the truth, you see. In the life of a medieval assassin, your reward for success is not rest. It's another mission, another name, another ghost added to your soul. And slowly, bit by bit, what remains of your humanity slips through your fingers like the blood you shed. Raven's second mark comes without ceremony, handed to him not on parchment, but as a name spoken softly by a man whose eyes look as if they've forgotten what sunlight means. Gregor of Lüneburg, a merchant, a seemingly ordinary man. But according to the Order, Gregor's letters, intercepted and decoded, suggest dealings with heretics and illicit correspondence with a rogue cardinal in Avignon. It doesn't matter whether the accusation is true. Raven knows that now. He's been told again and again that the world is not ruled by truth. It is ruled by balance. And assassins are the invisible fingers that tip the scales. This time Raven doesn't feel the cold bite of doubt, but nor does he feel resolve. What he feels is nothing. A numbing void, the kind of emptiness that isn't painful but weightless. And in that weightlessness, he moves quickly, quietly. Gregor operates from a house above his apothecary shop in the lower quarter of Lüneburg, a place that smells of resin and lavender, its walls lined with tiny drawers labelled in Latin and Greek. Raven poses as a mute beggar. It's an easy disguise, one that invites little conversation. He spends 3 days watching Gregor open the shop at dawn, grind herbs in the late afternoon, and linger at his writing desk long past the last bell. A routine man. Predictable. But perhaps, Raven thinks, that's what makes him dangerous. One night, as a storm breaks across the slate rooftops, Raven slips into the alley behind the apothecary. The downpour masks every sound, every creak, every breath. The back window, the smallest one above the cellar, is loosely barred. He lifts it open, slides through and lands softly beside a stack of damp firewood. From there, he waits, listens, counts the beats of time between lightning and thunder. Footsteps. Gregor descends the stairs holding a lantern. He's alone, muttering to himself. Raven presses his body against the shadows. He watches the merchant remove a bundle from beneath the floorboards. A scroll, wax-sealed, just long enough for Raven to glimpse the broken sigil of Avignon. A letter, perhaps a secret one, perhaps just an invoice. He'll never know. Raven moves. But this time, it's not clean. Gregor turns at the last moment. The lantern drops, glass shatters. A flare of firelight reveals Raven's face, pale, ghost-like in the gloom. Gregor screams, but it's short-lived. The dagger is quick but not silent. Not this time. The clamour draws neighbours. A woman cries out. A man pounds on the door. Raven flees through the back over mud-slick roofs, slipping once, cutting his palm open on a rusted nail. His breath is ragged, his pulse disobedient. His heart, that traitor, thuds not with triumph but alarm. By the time he reaches the edge of town, drenched and dripping, he knows the cost of failure isn't just capture, it's recognition. Someone saw him. Someone will remember. And so the Order makes a choice. They do not chastise him, not directly. But Raven is kept from missions for weeks. Not as punishment, they say, but as reflection. During that time, he is assigned to menial tasks, grinding bone charcoal, cleaning blades, and burning the personal effects of assassins who never returned. It is in this silence, this slow purgatory, that Raven begins to notice things he had long ignored. The others, the older ones, don't speak unless necessary. Their eyes are always half closed, scanning even in rest. Their hands twitch during sleep. Some whisper names in the dark, names they are not supposed to remember. One, called Ash, weeps at night, always just before dawn, never loud. Raven hears it through the stone wall they share, soft, broken sobs, muffled beneath a thin blanket. No one mentions it. No one dares. To show sympathy is to invite suspicion, and suspicion is fatal. But one morning, Ash is gone. His bed rolled tightly, his locker emptied, no word, no trail. Raven doesn't ask. He returns to his own training. But things feel different now. His hands, once so obedient, hesitate when holding the blade. His breath catches when he walks through the mortuary to deliver herbs. He begins to look at the world again, not through the eyes of a hunter, but a boy. A boy wondering if he will ever stop being afraid of the quiet. Then one day, a new arrival enters the compound, a girl. No older than Raven had been when he came. She is brought in under guard, but not like a prisoner. She walks with her head high, her arms crossed, defiant. Her name, Raven hears later, is Lise. And unlike the others, she asks questions. Why do we serve blindly? Who decides who is guilty? Do we ever stop? No one answers her, but Raven listens. One evening, in the training yard, Lise approaches him. She stands silently beside him as he sharpens his blade, then says quietly, "Do you even remember your real name?" He does. Barely, but he says nothing. She doesn't press, just walks away, as if she didn't expect a reply. But her question lingers, echoing louder than the clash of swords or the hiss of steel. That night, Raven dreams again of the woman's face, the one from childhood, blurred and pale. Only this time, she says something. A word he hasn't heard in years. Elias, his name. It jolts him awake, heart racing. Palms damp. The void that had kept him numb for so long begins to crack, and through that fracture something even more terrifying leaks in. Memory, not of the kills, but of the silences between them. Of the parts of him that were stripped away to make room for obedience. Of the child he once was. A child who had feared thunder, not because it was loud, but because it made him feel small and alone. He doesn't sleep again that night, and when dawn comes, he doesn't go to the training yard. He walks instead to the library vaults where scrolls of forgotten marks are kept, where the names of those cleansed lie inked in blood-coloured wax. There in the dust he finds Gregor's file, and beside it, written in the margin in a tight, slanted hand, letter intercepted, false sigil, no confirmed heresy, risk minimal. Raven reads it twice, then he burns it, not out of duty, but out of shame, and as the ashes curl skyward, he wonders, quietly, deeply, if he is still human, or if whatever he was died long ago in that freezing vault where boys lost their names. There is a particular kind of silence that comes after a revelation, not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of things unravelling. Raven walks through that silence like a man in a dream, but the world around him does not slow. The order continues. The bells still toll for morning drills, blades still clash in the practice yard, recruits still vanish and return changed, or don't return at all. But Raven, no, Elias now, if only in his own mind, moves differently. He does what is expected. His steps are measured, his eyes obedient, but within him something has begun to stir. A dull ache in his chest where once there was only cold calculation. He is not yet defiant, not yet disloyal, but a part of him is listening, remembering, becoming. Lise notices. She does not speak of it openly. No one in the order dares, but one day during a routine sparring match she strikes high and Elias ducks late slower than he should. Her blade slices across his shoulder, not deep, but sharp enough to bleed. He winces, steps back and prepares to reset. But she lowers her sword. "You're not afraid of the blade," she says under her breath. "You're afraid of what it would mean if you used it again." He says nothing, but his silence is an answer. That night they meet again, unspoken, unplanned, on the ramparts of the old keep that looms over the Order's compound. The air is bitter, scented with wood smoke and iron. Below them, the younger recruits chant drills in unison. Above them, the stars flicker behind a veil of frost. Lise leans against the parapet. "I asked too many questions," she says quietly. "That's why I was sent here, not because I killed the wrong person, but because I doubted why I was told to kill him." Elias studies her face in the dim light. There's something in her expression, a blend of tired defiance and quiet grief that he recognizes. Not fear, not guilt, but mourning. "They said I would forget," she continues, "said the Order would carve away the rot, but I think they mistook memory for rot." He wants to say something, anything, but words still come hard. Too many years of silence have made his voice feel like a broken instrument. Instead, he asks softly, "What was his name?" Lise doesn't hesitate. "Thomas, my brother." The wind howls between them, carrying the weight of her words into the night. Elias nods once, slow, solemn. In the days that follow, something changes between them. Not overtly, not in ways that would draw attention. But they start to move in tandem, speak with fewer words, understand each other in glances and half gestures. A bond forms, not of romance, not yet, but of recognition. They are mirrors, fractured, fogged and forged in the same fire. Then, just as the frost begins to thaw and the fields beyond the walls show the first signs of green, a new mission arrives. But it's not a name, it's a place. Rennes. A city once loyal to the crown, now whispered to be breeding dissent. The order has intercepted letters again, murmurs of rebellion. A bishop speaking out in veiled sermons, a merchant guild refusing to pay royal tithes. The balance, they say, is tipping. The assignment is simple. In theory, reconnoitre the city, identify key agitators, eliminate the threat. Elias is not chosen alone. Lais is sent with him. It's the first time he's been partnered on a mission. The order rarely permits such attachments, but they are told it is pragmatic. Elias knows better. This is a test, one designed not just for efficiency but for observation. They travel as travelling scribes, carrying forged papal documents and a basket of falsified relics. The road is long, wet with spring thaw and thick with mud. They say little at first, conserving energy, watching the tree line for movement, the skies for omens. But on the fourth night, as they camp beneath the ruined arch of an old Roman bridge, Lais breaks the silence. If we find them, she says, eyes fixed on the fire, the agitators, if they are guilty but right, what will you do? Elias doesn't answer right away. Instead, he leans back against his pack, letting the flames blur his vision. He thinks of Gregor, of Ash, of the scroll he burned, of the boy he once was. I don't know, he admits, but I think I'll know when I see them. They arrive in Rennes at dusk. The city is tense. Guards patrol more frequently. Market stalls are quieter than usual. Even the air feels strained. Whispers follow them down the narrow streets. Foreigners always draw eyes, but they blend well. Elias's forged credentials earn them access to the local monastery, where they pose as scholars reviewing ecclesiastical correspondence. It's a clever cover, but not a perfect one. Within days, they identify the bishop mentioned in the intercepted letters, a tall, wiry man named Bernard de Clare. He speaks not of rebellion directly, but his sermons are laced with implication. He questions the morality of tribute, the silence of kings, the rights of the people to refuse cruelty. Elias listens from the back pew, cloaked and hooded. The words stir something in him, not just memory, not just doubt, but fire. One evening, as the sky turns copper and bells ring out from the city's heart, Elias and Lais follow Bernard from the cathedral through a winding maze of alleys. He stops at a low stone house, knocks twice, pauses, then knocks again. The door opens. A woman greets him. Inside, candlelight flickers on parchment-covered tables. They wait. 2 hours pass. Elias almost turns away, but then the door opens again, and the woman emerges. Older than she first appeared, her back hunched from years of labour, her eyes dark and direct. Elias recognizes her, not her name, not her voice, but her, the face, the one from his dreams, the one he could never fully remember. He stumbles back. Lais catches him by the arm, eyes narrowed. What is it? He doesn't answer. He can't, because he doesn't know if the face he just saw is real or a memory finally clawing its way out of the pit where the order buried it. All he knows is that everything has just changed. Again. That night, Elias cannot sleep. He lies on a straw mattress in the attic of a tanner's house, listening to the quiet creak of beams above and the rain-softened murmur of the city below. But none of it reaches him. Not really. Not the familiar ache of muscles worn from trailing marks, nor the usual dull alertness that keeps an assassin halfway awake even in rest. Instead, his mind burns. That face, that woman. It was too vivid to be a dream. Her features worn by time but unmistakable, shadows of his earliest memories clinging to her cheeks, her eyes the slope of her brow. The way her hands moved when she opened the door, precise but gentle. It wasn't just recognition. It was something deeper. Older. It was her. He doesn't tell Liz, not yet. He rises before dawn, dressing in silence. The city is still sleeping when he slips out. The streets glisten with rain, and the lamps burn low. He walks with purpose, but keeps his hood low, his steps light. It would not do to be noticed now. He circles the house from the night before. It stands at the end of a narrow alley, half hidden by ivy, and built against the curve of the old Roman wall. The candles inside are dark now, the shutters closed, but the memory of her face lingers in the air like smoke. He doesn't knock, just watches, and in the stillness he remembers. A fire, a marketplace, a scream that wasn't his. And then hands, her hands, lifting him from the dirt, holding him close, running through the alley as bells rang behind them. A name whispered. Not his false name, his real one, Elias, his mother. He doesn't know how long he stands there, heart thudding, breath shallow, long enough for the sun to rise behind the clouds, long enough for the doubt to crawl back in. She was supposed to be dead. That was what they told him. When the order took him in, when they stripped him of name and past, they said his family was gone. A fire, bandits, a tragic loss, nothing left to mourn. But she is here, alive, and with the bishop. Back at the tanner's attic, Lise is waiting. She doesn't scold him, doesn't ask where he's been. She only looks at him with that quiet, searching gaze that sees too much. You followed her, she says. He nods. She's your mother. He flinches, not at the truth of it, but at how easily she sees it. I think so, he says. I don't remember everything, but yes. Lise doesn't speak for a moment, then she sighs, long and low. Then this mission isn't a mission anymore, not for you. No, he says, it's not. But the mission still exists. The Order's expectations still hover over them like a noose. They have a decision to make. The logical path, the one they were trained to follow, would be simple. Return, report, name the agitators, deliver the dagger in the dark. But logic cracks in the face of memory. And Elias has stared into the eyes of the lie he's lived too long. They spend the next 2 days shadowing the house discreetly. Elias refuses to approach her. Not yet. Instead he watches, observes. He learns her name, Mireille. She's no noblewoman, no schemer, just a healer, quiet, respected, known for treating the poor without charge. The bishop visits her often, not as a conspirator, but as a friend, a confidant. They share meals, talk softly, exchange letters sealed with the bishop's personal mark. It's not rebellion, it's something older, wiser, truth. And that's what terrifies Elias most, because if the Order sent them here to eliminate such people, then everything he has believed, everything he has killed for, begins to rot at the root. One evening, as the bells ring out for Vespers, Elias finally tells what he knows, what he remembers. The fire, the scream, the lie. She listens in silence. When he finishes, she takes a long breath. We can leave, she says, now, tonight, before the letter arrives. The letter. Every mission ends with confirmation. A courier from the Order brings final instructions, often disguised in merchant records or Holy Writ. It will arrive soon, maybe tomorrow, maybe sooner. And once it does, delay will be suspicion. Disobedience will be death. Elias doesn't answer her, not right away. Instead, he looks out the attic window toward the hills beyond the city. The road is there, empty, winding, promising escape, a future, a chance at something else. But then he speaks, and his voice is colder than he expects. If we disappear, they'll come after us. They already are, Lise says. They just don't know it yet. The next day, the letter arrives. It is tucked into the binding of a monastery ledger, sealed in the wax of the high table. The courier says nothing, just bows and vanishes into the mist. Elias opens it alone. Inside, a list. Bernard de Clare, Bishop of Rennes, Mireille, apothecary and suspected courier, Lothaire, steward of Rennes, unconfirmed. 3 names. No details, no trial, just execution orders. Elias stares at the parchment for a long time. Then he folds it carefully, places it in the hearth and watches it burn. That evening he tells Lise everything. She doesn't ask for a plan, she doesn't offer objections, she just says, then we do this together. They spend the night gathering what they need, maps, coin, forged travel papers. They pack light, weapons but no insignia, no symbols of the Order, nothing that will tie them back. And then, in the final hour before dawn, Elias goes to the house. This time he knocks. The door opens. She stands there, older than he remembered, thinner, but still her. Eyes that know him before he speaks. Mireille? He asks, voice shaking. Her hand rises slowly, touches his cheek, and she says, I never stopped looking for you, Elias. He doesn't cry, but something inside him breaks free, something that was buried beneath years of obedience and silence, something real. Behind him the sun rises, and for the first time in a decade, he does not feel like a ghost. Mireille moves aside without a word, letting Elias step through the doorway and into the dim, warm hush of her home. It smells faintly of dried herbs, parchment, and beeswax. Familiar, but distant. like a memory that has grown old in the dark. The shutters are still closed, letting in only the faintest spill of morning light, just enough to cast long shadows across the wooden beams and the low table set for two. He stands there, just inside the threshold, unsure whether to sit or speak or run. But Mireille doesn't press him. She merely watches, her hands clasped in front of her, as if she fears that touching him again might wake her from some long-held dream. "You've grown," she says at last, the words trembling slightly. Elias almost laughs, not out of humour, but from the sheer absurdity of the understatement. Grown? He had vanished from her world as a boy of 7. He returns now as something else. Not quite man. Not quite Shadow. Not quite her son either. But he wants to be. A part of him does. He lowers his hood, lets her see him fully. The scar on his temple, the jagged line across his chin from a blade he'd caught too late, the hollow behind his eyes. "I didn't know you were alive," he says. "They told me the fire, that everyone had died." Mireille nods slowly as she lowers herself into the chair by the table. There was a fire. That part was true, but it was no accident. They came in the night. Soldiers, not of the crown, but hired blades. They weren't after me. They were looking for your father. Elias's breath catches. My father? Another ghost. Another name he thought long buried. He was involved in something, she says, staring into the grain of the table as if the details lived there. Not rebellion, not directly, but knowledge. He was a scholar, Elias. He asked questions, dangerous ones, about taxes, about faith, about justice, about the way things were supposed to be. Elias sinks slowly into the opposite chair. The Order must have thought he was a threat. They did, she says, and so they came to erase him. But he wasn't home that night. You and I were. I hid you in the storeroom. I ran when they set the fire. I thought you were behind me. You weren't. He closes his eyes. He can remember now. Flashes of the flames, the heat on his face, the shriek of timber giving way. A hand dragging him through smoke. Not her hand. A stranger. A man who smelled of oil and leather. Then a black-robed figure with a voice like frost telling him he was lucky to be alive, that his past had died and he had been chosen. I looked for you for years, she says softly, but you'd disappeared. No records, no graves, just gone. I was taken, Elias says, by the Order. They renamed me, trained me. Mireille doesn't ask the name. She doesn't flinch either. You became what they wanted, she murmurs. For a long time I believed in it. She meets his eyes. Do you still? Elias doesn't answer right away. Instead, he reaches into his satchel and pulls out the ash-stained remains of the letter he burned. He sets it gently on the table between them. They want you dead, you and the bishop. Mireille doesn't blink. I know. You know? I suspected it the moment I saw you, your face. You may wear a different name, but I'd know you in any shadow. Her voice trembles for the first time. But she steadies herself quickly. I've lived too long near these powers not to see their patterns. You weren't the first they sent, but you're the first to hesitate. Elias stares at her. There were others? One. Years ago, younger. I spoke to him, told him about your father, about the things we stood for. I thought I had reached him. She looks down. He didn't kill me, but he killed the bishop's friend, a poet, a good man. We buried him in silence. The boy disappeared, I think. He was punished for not finishing the job. Elias imagines that boy now. Imagines him facing the choice, the terror, the same weight that now bears down on his own soul. Perhaps that boy too had cracked. Perhaps the Order consumed him from within. I'm not going back, Elias says quietly. I didn't think you would, she says. They sit there in silence once more. And then Mireille does something unexpected. She stands and walks into the adjoining room. A moment later, she returns with a small worn box bound in leather cord. She sets it gently before him. I've kept this since the night they came. It's all that survived. It's yours. Elias opens the box with hesitant fingers. Inside, a wooden horse, chipped at the legs. A piece of cloth, his father's scarf, perhaps. A crude drawing on vellum of a family. 3 figures with crude ink smile faces. And beneath it all, a medallion. Not religious, not noble, just simple. Etched with the letter E. The wave hits him harder than any blade. A lifetime of numbness collapses. He bows his head and grips the box as if anchoring himself against the tide of memory. I don't know who I am anymore, he says. You're Elias, Mireille says gently. Not just the name, the soul. He exhales, shaky, unsure. Outside, the city stirs to life. Carts creak. Merchants shout. Somewhere a bell chimes. And back in the attic, Lys waits. Elias knows what must happen next. The Order will send another if he fails to return. They will wonder, suspect, investigate. Their reach is long, and they have eyes everywhere. He rises from the chair, closes the box, and places it carefully into his satchel. "I need to protect you," he says. "You already are," she replies, but he shakes his head. "Not like this. If I disappear, they'll hunt you, unless they believe the mission was complete, unless they see what they want to see." Mireille's eyes harden. "You mean to fake it? Yes. It's dangerous. It's the only way." And in that moment, Elias knows what he must do, not as a tool of the Order, not as a ghost, but as a son, as a man reclaiming the shape of his soul. He leaves without another word, stepping back into the wet light of morning, his mind already crafting the deception, the illusion, the betrayal of the very people who once taught him to betray. Only this time, the betrayal would be justice. Lys listens with narrowed eyes as Elias recounts everything, his conversation with Mireille, the memories it unearthed, the box, the truth. He lays it bare without flinching, not to justify, not to plead, but because this is the first moment in a long time when secrecy feels like a heavier weight than honesty. When he finishes, Lys is silent. Her fingers tap the hilt of her dagger where it rests on the wooden table between them. It is the only sound in the attic. "You want to make the Order believe they're dead," she says. He nods. "Yes." She shifts her gaze toward the tiny, soot-darkened window overlooking the city rooftops. The light outside is pale, wintry. Smoke curls from chimneys. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks. She doesn't speak for a long moment, and Elias watches her, patient. Then, quietly, she says, "I'll help you." He lets out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "But you understand," she continues, "we won't just be fleeing. We'll be fugitives, apostates. The Order doesn't forgive failure, and it never forgets betrayal. I know. We'll be hunted, not just by strangers, but by the ones we trained with. People who know our tricks, our silence, our steps." "I know," he says again. Lys rises and walks to the corner of the attic where her travel gear lies bundled. She begins unpacking it methodically. Rope, dried provisions, a pouch of crushed charcoal, small glass flasks wrapped in wool. The preparations of a killer, laid out with the precision of ritual. And yet now that same precision would be used for something entirely different. Not death, disappearance. "We'll need bodies," she says without looking at him. He swallows. "I was hoping we could fake it." "You can't fake a corpse the Order doesn't inspect." Silence returns. But it is different now. Heavier, edged with a reality he had not yet fully faced. "They must believe we completed the mission," Lys goes on. "That we silenced the bishop and your mother. That we eliminated Lothair too. 3 confirmed kills. Anything less will raise questions." "And then," Elias asks, "we vanish. But first, we stage the scene. Fire, perhaps. Something that leaves enough ruin, enough charred bone, but not so complete that they suspect we wanted it to be perfect." Elias lowers his gaze. How many innocent people have to die to make that lie work? Lys looks at him then, not with cruelty, but with clarity. "We're not choosing between clean and dirty, Elias, just between possible and impossible." He knows she's right, but that doesn't soften the choice. "We find bodies," she says, "unclaimed, forgotten. The city's poor are buried without name in the charnel pits outside the southern wall. The gravediggers drink more than they guard." Elias nods, though the idea turns his stomach. "We'll need time," he says. 2 days, maybe 3. Lys frowns. "The Order will expect a raven by tomorrow evening. Delay too long and they'll come themselves." "Then we send a raven," Elias says, voice steadying. "A report. Brevity and precision. Just enough to buy us 2 more nights." Lys considers, then nods. "We'll make it work." That night, the plan begins. Elias returns to Mireille's home under the cover of fog. She lets him in without a word, though her eyes ask 100 questions. When he explains the plan, the staging, the fire, the use of the dead, her hands tremble for the first time since he found her. But she does not protest. "I will do what I must," she says. "For you, for truth." She agrees to vanish from the city by dawn 2 days hence, guided by a trusted herbalist from the hills who owes her an old, unpaid debt. A man who asks no questions. She will go by cart under a false name, through roads the Order no longer watches. The bishop, too, is warned. Bernard de Clare listens in silence as Elias and Lys reveal the Order's intent. He does not flinch nor raise his voice. He simply nods, folds his hands and whispers, "Then I have preached my last sermon in Wren." He will ride east, alone, disguised as a pilgrim, blending into the tide of wanderers heading toward the lesser shrines for spring rites. His face will vanish into the crowd, his name into rumour. It is only the steward Lothair they cannot find. Word says he has fled the city already, either warned or wise. The third name on the list will have to be covered with ash and ambiguity. That same evening, under cloak of darkness and rain, Elias and Laius slip from the city and ride to the southern pits. The air is foul with rot, the ground sodden and slick, a place forgotten by the living but not yet finished with the dead. They find what they need. 2 bodies, no older than middle age, nameless, unmarked. Another, just a youth. Victims of plague or hunger, who can say? The details don't matter to the order, only that the count is right, only that the blood is convincing, only that the lie is deep enough to bury truth beneath it. They work in silence. The following day is spent preparing the house. Mireille and the bishop leave under separate cover, no goodbyes, no embraces. The moment demands detachment, even if hearts rebel. Once gone, Elias and Laius move quickly, dressing the bodies in borrowed clothes, positioning them just so. They lace the walls with spirits, blacken the window frames with pitch. They scatter pages of false letters written in the bishop's hand, documents heavy with heresy, marked with symbols the order has long learned to fear. By nightfall, the house waits only for fire. And it comes, a torch to the wall. A breath of wind, a hiss, a roar, and then heat that curls back their hair and smoke that bites their throats. Flames climb like starving things. The roof groans. They do not watch long. They vanish into the city's veins, melt into alleys, and leave behind only fire and silence. By dawn, the smoke still rises. The order will see what it wants to see. And Elias, who had once been nothing more than a shadow trained to extinguish light, now walks away not as a ghost, but as something more dangerous. A man reborn in the fire he was meant to wield. The smoke lingered for days. It curled through the alleys of Wren like a ghost, mourning its own birth. People spoke of the fire in hushed tones. Some said it was an accident, others whispered of a purge, of divine judgment, of sins brought to ash. No one dared look too closely. In cities where power loomed invisible and violent, survival depended on not asking the wrong questions. Elias and Laius were long gone before the embers cooled. Their path took them east, away from the coast and deeper into the green gut of the countryside. They travelled light, wrapped in plain clothes, with forged papers naming them as pilgrims, he a scribe seeking indulgence, she a widow in mourning. They stopped in no town for longer than a meal, slept in stables or forests, and drank from creeks when coin ran low. It was a life of movement, of silence, of watching every road behind them. But it was also the closest Elias had come to peace in years. Not because he felt safe, he didn't. The order's reach was long, and its silence meant nothing. A month could pass before they sent another to investigate, or a week, or a day. Every shadow might hold the next blade. No. Peace came not from safety, but from clarity. For the first time since he was a boy, Elias was walking not by command, but by choice. It changed something inside him. In the small town of Belay, nestled between low hills and mist-choked vineyards, they paused for 3 nights under the guise of resting sore feet. A kind-hearted old woman let them sleep in her hayloft for the price of a mended fence. While Elias worked, Lise spent her afternoons among the market stalls, listening for any signs of pursuit. Whispers, out-of-place travellers, the scent of money too clean to be local. One evening, as dusk painted the horizon in lavender and grey, they sat beneath a tree on the edge of a meadow, sharing a crust of bread and a flask of rough wine. The sky above was wide and still, pierced with the first shy stars. Lise leaned back, arms crossed behind her head. "We're ghosts now," she said softly, "but I don't feel like one." Elias turned toward her. "What do you feel like?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed on the sky. Then she said, "Like I've been drowning in silence my whole life, and now I'm finally breathing." He understood. Not just the words, but the weight behind them. They both had bled in the name of silence, had killed and buried pieces of themselves in the process. To feel anything now, wind on skin, laughter in the distance, the ache of muscles that came from labour and not violence, was to feel alive again. But the order would not let them remain alive for long. On the fourth morning in Belay it began. A rider. Not fast, not loud, but wrong. Too clean, too still-eyed. Asking the wrong questions at the tavern, carrying no coin but expecting respect. Dressed as a friar, but moving like a killer. Lise saw him first. She returned to the loft just before sunrise, breathless. We have to leave, now. Elias didn't argue. They packed in minutes, leaving behind only the folded blanket and a thank you scrawled on parchment. The woman would think them kind-hearted travellers. She would not know they'd vanished because death was one step behind them. By noon, they were in the woods. The road was too exposed now. They moved on foot, eastward again, deeper into the trees. But it wasn't enough. That night, the friar appeared again. Elias saw him first this time, just beyond the tree line, still and patient as dusk fell. No horse now, just a blade at his side and a satchel slung across his back. They didn't wait for him to come closer. They ran, through the thickets, over roots and moss-slick stones. The forest swallowed their footsteps, but offered no safety. This was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of the hunted. For 2 days they ran, sleeping in shifts, eating what little they had left, and all the while the friar followed, always distant, always watching, never rushing. A predator who knew his prey would tire before he did. On the third night, Elias and Lise stopped, not from failure but from resolve. They built no fire, said no words. They waited. When he came, it was like the wind had brought him, soundless, sudden, inevitable. He stepped into the clearing just after midnight. His hood was down. His face was pale and clean, eyes calm and cold as riverstone. "I hoped it wasn't you," he said. Elias stood slowly, blade already drawn. "Do I know you? We trained together, once, before they gave you your first name. A flicker of memory, a sparring circle, a broken rib, a voice muttering Latin under its breath. "Arlen," Elias said. The man nodded. Lise rose behind Elias, blade in hand. "You were always quiet," Arlen said, "but good, too good to vanish like a coward." "I didn't vanish," Elias replied. "I chose." Arlen shook his head slowly. "You broke the order." "No, the order broke itself." The fight was fast. Assassins do not waste time with flourish. There is no poetry in real combat, only survival. Steel met steel, sparks bit the dark. Arlen moved with precision born of training, but Elias moved with something more, something rawer. He had something to protect, not just his life, but his soul. Lise struck first. Arlen parried, turned, slashed. She fell back, grazed. Elias closed the gap, their blades locked. Arlen sneered. "You think you're free?" Elias leaned in. "I know I'm not yours." And he drove the dagger into Arlen's side. Not fatal, not yet. Arlen staggered, dropping to one knee. Lise stood over him, breathing hard, blood trickling down her arm. She raised her blade, but Elias stopped her. "Let him live." Lise stared at him. "Why?" "Because he'll tell them what he saw, that we don't run, that we fight." They bound Arlen's hands, left him with water, and vanished before dawn. They didn't speak for hours afterward. The forest swallowed the night behind them, and with each step, Elias felt something shift inside. He had spared a man who would not spare him, not from mercy, not from weakness, but from choice. And that choice meant everything. The days that followed passed in fragments, light and dark, hunger and brief moments of fullness, sleep that came in snatches between tree roots or under rain-soaked cloaks. Neither Elias nor Lise spoke much, not out of fear, but necessity. Every word now was a luxury, and silence was armor. They moved east, avoiding roads and villages, navigating by stars when clouds allowed, or by rivers when the heavens were hidden. Their destination was a whisper, not a place. Somewhere beyond the reach of the order, if such a place still existed. Elias thought often of Arlen. He imagined the man waking where they left him, bleeding but alive, humiliated but breathing. Elias hoped he would survive, hoped he would return to the order and tell the truth. But he also knew better. The order did not reward failure, even when laced with loyalty. Arlen's return might be the spark that lit a larger flame. The message would be clear now. Elias and Lise had not merely vanished. They had declared war. One night, nearly a week after the fight, they found shelter in the crumbling ruins of an old watchtower half swallowed by the forest. Its upper levels had collapsed decades ago, leaving only the stone base and the suggestion of a spiral stair. Moss blanketed the interior like a shroud, and the air smelled of damp earth and forgotten battles. But it was dry and safe. For now. They lit no fire. They sat in the gloom, wrapped in cloaks, sharing the last of their salted meat and old bread. Above them, wind howled through broken stone like a warning. Elias was the first to speak. "You didn't have to stop me." Elias looked up. "Back with Arlen," she said. "You could have let me end it." "I know. Then why?" He thought about it. "I wanted him to see," Elias said at last, "what it looks like to make a choice, not out of fear, not out of obedience, but because it matters." Lise was quiet for a moment. Then she leaned her head back against the wall, closed her eyes. "That won't be the last time," she said. "I know," he replied. Sleep came heavily that night, dragging Elias under like a tide. He dreamt, though not in the way he once had. These dreams were clearer now, not fragmented. They came in colours and voices. He saw his father, not as a ghost or blur, but standing in a small study, candlelight flickering across parchment and books. His voice was soft, speaking to someone Elias couldn't see. "The truth isn't dangerous because it's false," his father said. "It's dangerous because it demands something of you, and most people don't want to give that much of themselves." Elias woke before dawn. Lise was still asleep, her breathing slow and steady. He stepped outside into the mist, where the trees loomed tall and silent. The world was pale, quiet, a breath held. He thought about the order. What frightened them wasn't rebellion. It wasn't words or symbols or secrets. It was people who made their own choices, people who stopped obeying. The order could crush enemies, but they couldn't unmake conviction. And Elias had begun to feel something dangerously close to conviction. They travelled for 2 more days without incident. On the 3rd, they reached the village of Saint-Giroux. It was not on most maps, just a cluster of homes and a chapel nestled in a river bend, surrounded by wheat fields and low hills. Elias had heard of it once, long ago, during a whispered conversation between 2 older assassins. They spoke of it not as a haven, but as a blind spot, a place untouched. Not because it was hidden, but because it was deemed unimportant, too small to matter. That was precisely why it might be safe. The villagers watched them with cautious eyes, but offered no hostility. A widow let them stay in her empty barn in exchange for labour. Elias split wood, Lise carried water, and neither asked for coin. They were just 2 travellers, weary and quiet, with eyes that looked beyond the fields to dangers the villagers could not see. They stayed a week of stillness, of breathing, of letting their wounds begin to close, not just the ones on their skin, but the deeper, older ones. The kind left by years in the dark. Elias began to write again. Late at night, by the fading light of a stub candle, he took scraps of old parchment and began to put down what he remembered. Not of the missions, not the kills, but the silences, the small betrayals of self, the faces of the forgotten. It wasn't for revenge, it was for record. The order lived by erasing. He would fight by remembering. One evening he brought his writings to Lise. She sat by the barn door, sharpening her blade in slow, steady strokes. She read in silence. When she finished, she looked up. "You're trying to make sense of it?" "Yes." "You think writing it down will make it easier?" "No," Elias said, "but it might make it true." She studied him for a long time, then nodded once. "Then keep writing." But peace, even brief, does not last. On the 9th day, Elias saw the sign. Not obvious, just a mark, scratched into the wood of the chapel's doorframe. A circle with a line through it. To most it meant nothing, but to him it was loud as a bell. The order had been here, not recently, but enough to know this place, enough to have eyes watching. He showed Lise. She didn't panic, she didn't speak, she simply began packing. They left that night, beneath a sky heavy with stars, walking into the unknown once more. They were no longer fugitives, they were witnesses. And that made them more dangerous than any assassin the Order had ever trained. The wind changed as they crossed the next ridge. It came colder, sharper, slicing through their cloaks like needles. The trees here grew sparse and twisted, as if even nature had learned to bow in the presence of silence. Below, the land dipped into a valley, a basin veiled in morning fog with no visible road, only scattered trails and the glint of distant streams winding like veins beneath the pale sky. Elias paused at the crest, one hand resting on a bare tree branch. Lise stood beside him, her breath visible in the chill. Neither spoke for a long moment. "It's different," she said eventually, her voice barely above the wind. He nodded. "It feels untouched." They made their way down carefully, taking narrow paths between rocks and ice-slick moss. The valley seemed endless, its silence too deep. No birds, no rustle. Even the air tasted still. By nightfall, they found an abandoned mill near a frozen creek. The wheel had long stopped turning, its frame thick with moss and decay, but the inside was dry, and that was enough. They lit a small fire, just enough for warmth, tucked deep into the hearth and shielded by stones. The flames cast strange shapes on the rotting beams, and Elias found his eyes lingering too long on the shadows. He felt them again. Not people, not movement, but memory, a presence that never quite left. Liz must have noticed the tension in his shoulders. "You feel it too," she said. "Yes." She tilted her head slightly. "The order?" "No," he murmured. "Worse." He didn't mean danger, not physical. What he felt in the valley was something older, grief that had soaked into the ground, pain left unspoken for generations, the kind of emptiness that outlasts the people who first suffered it. Later that night, unable to sleep, Elias wandered to the edge of the creek. The moon was out, clear and distant, and its reflection rippled in the water. He knelt beside it and closed his eyes, and for a moment he remembered something from the earliest days of his training, a lesson whispered in the cold. "Still water remembers," his instructor had said. "It sees all. It reflects not what is, but what has been." He never understood that then, but now looking into the slow current he thought maybe he did, because as he saw them. Not their faces, not clearly, but impressions, shadows kneeling, voices raised in silent mourning, a procession of cloaked figures standing around the mill, one figure stepping into the water, another lying still beside it. Not assassins, villagers, the kind the Order had no reason to erase, unless they had seen something they shouldn't, unless they had known someone who fled. He stood and returned to the mill, where Liz sat mending a torn seam in her cloak. Her fingers moved with quiet focus, but her eyes lifted the moment he entered. "This place," he said. "It wasn't just abandoned, it was emptied." She tied off the thread. "Then we don't stay long." "No," he said, "but before we go, I need to see." At dawn they searched, not for people, there were none, but for remnants. Evidence, the kind no Order could fully erase. They found it in the old granary, hidden beneath a pile of rotted sacks, beneath floorboards warped by time and frost. Elias found a bundle, wrapped in oilcloth, protected. Inside, parchments, ink faded but legible, a ledger, and tucked inside its cover, a letter. He sat in the corner of the granary and read aloud, the words slow, the air growing colder around them. "To whoever finds this, we stayed as long as we could. They told us to forget what we saw, but how do you forget the dead? How do you forget the boy they took?" He didn't cry, even when they bound him. He looked at me, right at me, and I thought he was trying to say something, but the man behind him told me to close my eyes. I did. They burned the others, not in the open, in the mill, said it was pestilence, but it wasn't. It was cleansing. "If you find this, know that we tried, know that we remembered, and if you ever see the boy again, tell him we didn't forget." Elias's hands trembled. He looked at the signature, just a first name, Therin. He didn't recognize it, but the name didn't matter. What mattered was the memory. Someone had remembered, even when he couldn't. He folded the letter gently, tucked it back into the cloth and buried it beneath the floor again, this time not to hide it, but to protect it. They left the mill before noon. By nightfall, the valley was behind them, but Elias carried something new in his chest, something neither weapon nor wound. A thread, thin, almost invisible, connecting who he had been to who he was becoming. Not redemption, not yet, but remembrance. Snow fell that night, soft, steady, and soundless. It blanketed the hills behind them, erasing their footprints, and coated the trees ahead with a pale shimmer that caught the moonlight like a dream. Each flake drifted down like a secret, and as Elias and Lias walked beneath the hush of the forest canopy, it felt as though the world itself had agreed, for a brief moment, not to speak. They did not talk. The snow muffled every step, and the cold bit into their fingers and faces with quiet persistence. But neither of them complained. They had learned to make peace with discomfort. It was the cost of movement, the tax of freedom. By the second morning they found a trail, thin and partially buried, winding toward a village neither of them had heard of before. No signs, no markers, just smoke in the distance, rising in thin grey ribbons. Lice glanced toward Elias. He nodded. "We need supplies." They approached cautiously, keeping to the trees until the edge of the clearing came into view. The village, if could be called that, was no more than 8 or 9 houses arranged around a frozen pond. A small chapel leaned slightly to one side, its steeple missing. Children played with sticks in the snow, bundled in layers that looked more rag than fabric. A woman chopped firewood slowly beside a sagging barn. A man shoveled snow from a path, pausing every few minutes to rest his back. Elias saw no soldiers, no order presents, no signs, just wariness. They stepped out of the trees, heads down, cloaks pulled tight. Immediately the children stopped playing. The woman stopped chopping. The man leaned on his shovel and watched them approach. It wasn't hostility, it was wariness. The kind that grows from history, not instinct. Lys spoke first, her voice low. "We're travellers, pilgrims." The man by the shovel studied them a moment longer. Then he nodded slowly and gestured toward the largest building, a longhouse with smoke trailing from a crooked chimney. "You'll want to speak to Mara." Inside, warmth greeted them. Not much, but enough. A hearth at the centre glowed with coals, and several woven blankets hung from the rafters to block drafts. An older woman stood at the fire, her back straight despite her age. She wore a thick cloak, clasped with a carved wooden brooch shaped like a stag. She turned as they entered. Her eyes were grey, sharp. "I don't get pilgrims here," she said without preamble. Elias bowed his head slightly. "We're heading east. Weather caught us." She studied them. Then, slowly, she nodded. "You can stay one night, no charge, but you'll work." Elias stepped forward. "We're not afraid of work." That earned a small smile. By evening, Elias was splitting logs behind the longhouse while Lys assisted in mending a broken loom frame. The villagers kept their distance, but offered nods, quiet words. No one asked questions. No one pried. That night, after a thin stew and shared bread, Mara sat with them by the hearth. "You don't speak like pilgrims," she said casually, stirring the coals with an iron rod. Elias froze, but Lys replied without hesitation. "I was raised in a priory. I never made the vows." "And him?" Elias looked into the fire. "I served," he said, before. "Before what?" "Before I stopped." Mara didn't press. She simply nodded and leaned back. "I've seen his kind before," she said. "Not him exactly, but the ones with eyes like that, too quiet, too careful, always watching the exits." She sipped something from a cup. "They passed through here once, years ago. Cloaked, sharp, didn't speak unless necessary." Elias's breath slowed. Mara met his gaze. "They left with a boy." The room went silent. Elias stared at the fire, then said, "Did he cry?" "No," Mara said softly. "He didn't cry, but his hand reached out, toward the trees, toward a woman watching from the edge." His stomach turned. "Did she follow?" he asked. "No," Mara replied. "She disappeared into the forest. I never saw her again. But the snow that year didn't melt until late spring." Neither of them spoke. The fire crackled. Finally, Mara stood. "You're not the first to walk away," she said. "But most who do don't last long." Elias looked up. "Why are you telling me this?" She shrugged. "Because I buried the woman who disappeared. She died 5 winters later. Starved, probably. But she still had the boy's name carved on a piece of birch tied around her neck." He closed his eyes. Mara stepped away. The silence returned. That night, he couldn't sleep. Lys found him outside the longhouse, seated on a split log, snow gathering on his shoulders. She didn't speak, just sat beside him. After a while, he whispered, "She remembered me, even when I didn't know she existed." "She never stopped trying," Lys said. "Neither did you. They left the village at dawn." The children watched them go, silent but curious. Mara stood in the doorway of the longhouse, arms folded. As they passed the chapel, Elias paused. Scratched into the wood above the door, barely visible, nearly worn away by weather and time, was a mark. Faint, familiar. Not of the order. A half circle, a line, an old rebel's symbol. Elias touched it gently, then turned and walked away into the snow. The past, it seemed, was always just a step behind, but so was the truth. The snow grew deeper as they climbed. By now, the road, if it had ever truly been a road, was little more than a vague suggestion beneath the drifts. Trees thinned out into skeletal fingers reaching skyward, and the wind no longer whispered. It screamed, unrelenting, through the gaps in the stone. Mountains loomed to the north, great white towers against a washed-out sky, and Elias knew that once they crossed into the pass, they would leave the last traces of the world they had known. Below in the quiet country, they had still been fugitives. still shadows once belonging to a greater darkness. But beyond the ridge, into the highlands of the borderless wilds, they would become something else entirely, something forgotten, or something reborn. They didn't speak much as they ascended. Their breath came in clouds, and every footstep took effort. The cold gnawed at exposed skin. The only sounds were the creak of leather, the occasional snap of brittle branches, and the wind's endless howl. And yet, despite it all, Elias felt strangely awake. There was no comfort in the climb, but there was clarity. No politics, no hidden knives, no ancient orders cloaked in ritual and silence, just the elements, just survival. It was almost honest. At the third bend in the ridge, they found an old marker stone, half buried in snow, chipped and worn. A spiral carved into its face, the tail of the symbol pointing west. Elias knelt beside it, brushing away the frost with his glove. Lys came up beside him, breathing hard. "You recognize it?" He nodded. There were stories among the old scribes. Of what? Sanctuaries, places too remote, too wild to govern, where the old code still lived. Lys raised an eyebrow. The old code? He looked up at her. Before the order became what it is now, before they traded purpose for control. She didn't answer, but her eyes narrowed slightly, thoughtful, not skeptical. They moved on. The path narrowed. At points it was barely wide enough for one person. At others it disappeared entirely. They crossed frozen streams, clambered over broken shale, and twice had to backtrack after mistook deer paths for trails. Food grew scarce. Their dried meat was gone by the 5th day. Foraging was difficult, and hunting was nearly impossible in the snow. They shared what little they had left, roots, bitter berries, snowmelt boiled with pine needles. But neither complained. They were past complaining. On the 6th night, they made camp beneath a rocky outcropping. Elias had built a small fire, careful to shield it from view, and Lys sat sharpening her blade with slow, steady strokes. The sky was clear. Above them, 1,000 stars hung in stillness. Elias watched the flames, then glanced over. "Have you ever wondered," he said, "how many of them broke before we did?" Lys paused. "Who?" "The others, in the order." She considered that for a while, then resumed her sharpening. "I think most of them never realized they had a self to break." He nodded. Then, after a silence, "And what about us?" She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "We didn't break, we remembered." He didn't speak for a long time after that, because deep down he wasn't sure it was true. Part of him still lived in shadows. Part of him still moved like a knife in the dark, still measured exits, still felt the urge to disappear when eyes lingered too long. Those instincts didn't vanish just because he wished them away, but maybe remembering was enough. For now. They reached the summit on the 7th day, and what lay beyond was nothing they expected. A valley, vast and untouched. Thick forests nestled between snow-blanketed hills, and at its center, barely visible through the distant mist, a structure, a monastery, or what was once one. The stone was ancient, sunken in places, its towers broken like teeth. No smoke, no light, but still standing. Lys shaded her eyes against the sun's glare. "That can't be coincidence." "No," Elias murmured. "It's a place forgotten by design." They descended carefully, pacing themselves. The slope was steep and loose snow made every step a gamble. But by evening they stood at the tree line, staring up at the worn gatehouse of the monastery. Its doors were ajar, a single sigil carved into the arch, a spiral, half buried in moss. Elias stepped forward, one hand resting lightly on the hilt of his dagger. Inside, the silence was total. The courtyard was overgrown, stone paths cracked and scattered. Statues of saints leaned at odd angles, their faces weathered to anonymity. But the place was not ruined, just abandoned. Yet not recently. They passed into the inner hall, where a faint scent of smoke still clung to the air. Someone had been here, maybe days ago, maybe hours. In the center of the hall, on a long stone table, lay a single book, not dusty, not forgotten, open. Elias approached. The text was familiar, an old dialect used by the early brotherhoods before the order's doctrine overtook them. He translated aloud quietly. "To remember is to resist. To name what was lost is to break the spell of silence. Even in exile, truth endures." Lys stepped closer, her breath visible in the cold air. "They were like us," he nodded, "or who we were trying to be." A sound faint, a door creaking. Lys turned, blade half drawn, but there was no threat, just a figure. Old, hunched, wrapped in thick robes, eyes sunken but clear. He regarded them without fear. "You've come far," the old man said. "Most who flee never reach this place." Elias lowered his hood. "We're not fleeing," he said. "Then why are you here?" Elias looked around, at the crumbling stone, the firelight, the book, then finally at Lice. "To remember," he said, "and to learn what comes after." The old man said nothing at first. He simply studied Elias and Lice for a long moment, as though peering not at their faces but at the silence beneath them. He moved slowly, not from fear but from age, and every step he took across the stone floor whispered with the drag of heavy fabric and time. He came to stand by the open book, one hand resting gently on its edge. "You carry the shape of the order," he said at last, his voice rough but steady, "but not its weight." Elias didn't reply. The man turned a page with careful fingers, revealing a faded illustration, lines interwoven in spirals and circles, symbols not unlike the ones Elias remembered etched into the oldest corners of the Order's archives. But here they felt different, uncloaked, true. "We were the Order once," the man said, "or rather, we were what it was before it became teeth." Lai stepped forward, cautious. "You were assassins?" "No," the man replied, smiling faintly. "We were guardians, of balance, of silence, of stories too dangerous to be written, but we were not executioners." He looked up, his eyes bright in the firelight. The breaking came later. Elias felt the truth of those words settle in his bones. The weight of history, of choices bent until they cracked, pressed on the back of his neck like a cold hand. "We've been hunted," he said, "marked, we've seen what the Order became." "And you walked away," the man replied. "We ran," Lice said, "and fought." He nodded. "And yet you are still here." For a moment, no one spoke. Wind rattled the shuttered windows, and somewhere deep in the monastery's belly, a door creaked slowly open and closed in the breeze. "Who are you?" Elias asked. The man smiled. "My name is Brother Ciro. I am the last of the witnesses." Lice frowned. "Witnesses to what?" "To the fall," he said simply, "and to the choice that came after." He gestured toward the book. "When the old order was fractured, when blood replaced balance and doctrine replaced discernment, some of us left, not in protest, in mourning. We buried our names, burned our seals, and came here." "And the others?" Elias asked. "Some followed," Ciro said. "Most did not. They became what you now flee." He walked slowly toward a bench beside the fire, lowering himself with great care. "You should eat, rest. The climb is not just through snow." Elias and Lice hesitated. But then Lice unbuckled her belt and laid it gently beside the table. Elias followed. It was not surrender, just pause. A breathing moment in a life that had offered so few. They spent the night in one of the lower cells, a small room with stone walls, a straw-filled cot and a simple oil lamp. It was the warmest night they'd had in weeks. Elias could not sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts heavy with echoes. Not of danger, but of something harder to name. The possibility of permanence. The question of what it meant to stop running, not because you were caught, but because you'd finally found ground worth standing on. At dawn, Brother Ciro led them into the inner sanctum. A library, half crumbled but magnificent. Scrolls lined the walls in tight bundles. Books stacked in corners, many half-eaten by mould or time, others wrapped in cloth and sealed in wax. The room smelled of dust, ink, and the faint sweetness of dried roots. "These are the records," he said, "of what we were, of who we became, and of those who walked away." He handed Elias a small, narrow book, no title, bound in faded red leather. Inside were names, dates, places, marks that had been denied by the current order, stories erased, rewritten, or classified as heretical within the assassin's sanctums. Elias ran his fingers over one entry. Millwright's son. Witnessed the cleansing of Elm Hollow, hidden records preserved. Location unknown. He closed his eyes. Lice stood by the window, watching the light shift across the stone floor. "You said most didn't follow," she said to Ciro. "But some did." "Yes," he said, "and some still do. There are a few sanctuaries, not many, not strong, but real, places like this, places built on memory instead of fear." "And what do they do?" she asked. "Hide?" Ciro smiled gently. "They wait, they learn, they protect." "Protect who?" "Anyone still listening." Elias looked up. "There are others like us?" Ciro nodded. "Scattered, quiet, but yes. You are not the only ones to wake from the old dream." A long silence passed. Then Elias asked, "What happens now?" "That," Ciro said, "depends on what you're ready for." He led them to a table where parchment, ink, and old writing tools had been laid out. A candle flickered beside a wax seal, spiral-shaped, like the old mark they had seen on the monastery gate. "You came here to escape, but this is not a place of endings. It is a beginning." Elias looked at the parchment. "Right," Ciro said softly. "Your names, your truths, if you wish." Lise stepped forward first. She took the quill without hesitation and signed a name Elias had never heard before. Not Lise, her real name, a name buried long ago beneath steel and silence. Then she stepped aside. Elias stared at the parchment. The ink glistened black. His hand trembled as he took the quill, and slowly, deliberately, he wrote the name that had been stolen from him. Elias. No rank, no number, no falsehood, just a name. And with it, something new took root. Not resistance, but belonging. They stayed through the week. Ciro showed them the archives, the hidden pathways, the upper terraces where medicinal herbs grew in frost-resistant pots. They learned from the old texts, tactics lost to time, codes uncorrupted by ambition. No blades were drawn, no blood spilled. Only pages turned and minds opened. And when the time came to leave, Ciro gave them no orders, no maps, only one sentence. Find the others. Lise and Elias stood at the gates once more, cloaks drawn tight, breath clouding in the highland air. They did not look back, because this time they were not fleeing shadows. They were walking toward the light. The descent was slower than the climb. Not because of the snow, though it still fell in pale ribbons across the trail, or because of the wind, which remained sharp as broken glass, but because they were different now. Each step Elias and Lise took was heavy with something new. Not fear, but purpose. They were no longer running from the order. They were walking towards something deeper. The valley behind them, the monastery, the firelight, the spiral sigil etched in ancient stone, was not just a sanctuary. It had become a memory they chose to carry, a place that reminded them of who they had been, who they were becoming, and what had been lost in between. For the first time in years, Elias felt direction not forced upon him, but grown from within. They travelled south, through narrow gorges and dense pine forests, over frozen creeks and wind-polished stones. They ate little, spoke less, but their silence was no longer burdened with shame. It had transformed, now rich with understanding, even comfort. Lise began to draw maps, small ones sketched on old scraps of parchment they had taken from the monastery. She marked trails, landmarks, unusual rock formations, forgotten wells. She had a quiet hand, steady, and her memory for direction was sharper than Elias had realized. When he asked her why she bothered, she simply said, "Because if others come after us, they'll need to know how to move without being seen." Elias started recording names, not the ones the Order had given, the code names, the marks, the faceless summaries of lives ended, but real names, the ones that surfaced through whispered stories or fragments they unearthed in abandoned villages or rumors passed between wary travelers. He kept them in a small, leather-bound book given to him by Brother Ciro. Every page he filled felt like a small resistance, a candle lit in the dark. On the 8th day of travel, they reached the edge of a town. It was larger than the villages they had passed. Stone buildings, a worn central square, a church with a cracked bell that still rang on the hour. Traders passed through often. It was a place with enough bustle to blend into, but quiet enough not to raise alarm. They entered under assumed names. Husband and wife, grieving a lost child. Pilgrims returning from the northern shrine. No one questioned them. No one looked too hard. Elias paid for a room with coin older than the king on the throne, and the innkeeper didn't care. That night, they slept in real beds. In the dark, Elias asked him a question. "Do you ever think about the ones we killed?" Elias turned onto his side, staring at the ceiling. "All the time," he said. There was no bitterness in her voice when she replied, "Do you think they'd forgive us?" "I don't know," Elias said, "but I don't think forgiveness is the point." "Then what is?" "Remembering," he said, "and making sure it doesn't happen again." The next morning they visited the market square. It was busy but not chaotic. Bakers called to passing workers. A man sold leather boots from a wheeled cart. 2 children chased each other around a broken well. It could have been any town, any country. But Elias noticed something. A man at a stall selling spices wore a pendant around his neck. Simple. Wooden, a spiral, subtle, nearly worn smooth but unmistakable. He approached the stall asking for dried herbs. The man looked up, And in that brief moment their eyes met, and something ancient passed between them. Recognition. Not of face, but of weight carried in silence. The vendor didn't speak of it, but he folded the herbs in parchment and slipped something else in with them, a scrap of cloth, red, with a line of symbols embroidered in black thread. When Elias and Lais opened it later alone in their rented room, they read the message stitched into its edge. Beneath the chapel ruins of Dol Therin, 3 days south. It was unsigned. No seal. But the language was the same as the monastery, a thread, a signal. Someone was waiting. They left the next morning, just before sunrise. No goodbyes, no trail left behind. 3 days south took them through marshy fields and quiet woods. The roads here were seldom travelled, and what towns they passed were half abandoned or wary. They spoke little. But the quiet was alive now, with anticipation, with the strange thrum of something real building beneath the surface of the world. On the third night they arrived at the ruins. Dol Therin had once been a great place. Elias could feel it in the bones of the broken archways and the scattered stone columns. Moss clung to the rubble. The chapel had collapsed inward, and wild vines wound through the shattered stained glass. They waited until dusk. Then, as the last light faded, a figure emerged from the trees. Hooded, slim, barefoot, not a threat, a messenger. The figure said nothing, simply raised a hand, beckoned, and turned toward the crypt beneath the chapel. Lais followed first, Elias after. They descended a stair lit by torchlight, the air turning colder, the stone slick with age. At the bottom, a chamber, circular. Dozens of faces looked up from benches, cloaked figures, old and young, men and women, even children. Not soldiers, not assassins, but survivors, witnesses. And in the centre stood a woman with silver hair braided down her back. Her eyes were steady, her presence calm. She didn't smile, but she bowed her head in welcome. "You made it," she said. Lys nodded once. Elias stepped forward. "Are you the Resistance?" The woman tilted her head. "We are the memory," she said. "And now you are part of it." In that moment, Elias understood. The Order had hunted them because they believed silence was safety. That control was peace. That forgetting was the only way forward. But the truth, the dangerous, fragile truth, was that memory could bind people like iron. And now that memory was growing. They stayed in Dol Therin for 5 days. Time moved differently beneath the chapel ruins. There was no sun to mark its rise or fall, no bells to divide morning from evening. Light came from oil lamps hung from rusted sconces and from the careful glow of fire pits in the central chamber. The stone walls were cold, but the air was warm with voices, soft, careful, human. Not the bark of command or the sterile reports of the Order, but story, memory, witness. The woman with the silver braid was called Malin. She had once been a chronicler, trained in the early branches of the Order before its fracture. She had written history in codes, embedded memory into maps, and carved meaning into silence. But when the Order began erasing more than names, when it began unmaking truth, she walked away. Just like Elias, just like Lys, just like the others. They weren't many. 32 people in total lived beneath Dol Therin. Most weren't fighters. A few had once held blades. A handful still did. But most were something else entirely. Scribes, weavers, code runners, defectors who had escaped not through strength but through knowledge. Every night one person shared a story, not performed, not embellished, just told. A boy named Laren, no older than 15, recounted how his mother had hidden encoded letters in the hems of merchant cloaks, ferrying messages across 3 provinces until the Order caught her. A woman with shaking hands spoke of her sister, who had memorized entire archive chambers before vanishing into a snowstorm, hunted by men she'd once trained. And then there was the silent man. No name, no voice. He bore the scars of interrogation, hands that trembled, a jaw that clicked when he turned. But each morning he sat in the corner of the scriptorium, copying ancient texts by candlelight with immaculate precision, words preserved by a man who had none left. Elias watched, listened, and felt something growing inside him, a slow, quiet expansion. Not redemption. That word still tasted wrong, but belonging. He began to teach, not the ways of killing. He would not bring that here, but movement, awareness, the rhythm of survival, how to walk without sound, how to disappear in a crowd, how to look without being seen. Skills that could preserve life, not just end it. Lys trained a few of the younger ones in blade work, only enough to defend, never to pursue. Because once you chase, she told them, you become what you're running from. On the fourth day, Malin summoned Elias to the crypt's lower hall, a chamber sealed by ironwood doors, marked with a spiral carved deeper than any other. Inside were relics, not weapons, not gold, but truth. Scrolls, journals, pages smuggled from old strongholds, records stolen from the high table before it burned. Reports meant to be destroyed, buried, redacted, names of the silenced, maps of vanished villages, transcripts of trials that never officially occurred. A single shelf held volumes marked only with numbers. Elias recognized the format. Assassin ledgers, kill reports. Each number was a ghost, a name once buried. Malin watched him closely. "We want you to add yours," she said. He stared at the empty ledger before him, a red spine. A blank first page, a small ink pot waiting, still and black. "I don't know all of them," he said. "Then start with what you do." Elias dipped the quill. He did not write quickly. He began with Gregor of Lüneburg, the merchant who bled into silence while Elias still believed silence was noble. Then Leontius of Berwick, the man who died without knowing why. He wrote not just the names but the nights, the scent of the rooms, the resistance or lack thereof, the questions in their eyes. By the time he finished, he had only written 5. Only 5. But his hand shook as if he'd carried the weight of 100. He signed it, simply, Elias. Malin nodded once and placed the book on the shelf beside the others. No ceremony, no applause, just presence. Later, Lise found him in the chapel above, sitting alone on a fallen column, the wind threading through his cloak. "You wrote them," she said. He nodded. "I was afraid I wouldn't remember." "But you did." He looked out across the ruined countryside, snow swirling in low gusts. "It's strange," he said. "They told us remembering was weakness, that it dulled the blade." "They were wrong," she whispered. They sat in silence a while, and then Elias said something he hadn't spoken aloud since he fled the order. "I don't want to hide anymore." Lise turned to him. "Then don't." "I want to find the others," he continued. "Not just the ones like us. The ones still inside. The ones who don't know they've forgotten." "That's dangerous," she said. "Yes, but you're serious." He looked her in the eyes. "I'm done surviving," he said. "It's time we built something that remembers." Lust didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "Then we begin." That night, beneath the flickering glow of the fire pit, Elias stood before the 32. He didn't speak long. He didn't need to. "I don't want to fight the Order with fire," he said. "They've burned enough. I want to fight them with memory, with names, with truth. I want to make it impossible for them to erase another life." He held up his book. "And I want to find the others. Those who still think they're just tools, shadows, ghosts. I want to show them they're more." No one clapped, but no one looked away. When he finished, Malin approached with a small chest, iron-bound with old travel supplies inside. Parchment, quills, seals, a vial of encoded ink. A weathered map, marked only at the corners. She handed it to him. "It's not a weapon," she said, "but it's how we begin." Elias took it with both hands. That night, as the fire dimmed and the chamber quieted, he sat beside Lise and opened the map. Together they traced a path forward, not toward revenge, but remembrance. They departed Dol Therin under the weight of silence, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of understanding, dense, sacred, and heavy with intent. The early light cast long shadows through the broken arches of the ruined chapel as Elias and Lise crossed the threshold of the old stone gate, cloaks drawn tight, eyes forward. Behind them, Malin watched with a calm steadiness from the chapel wall, her silver braid catching the breeze like a thread tied to memory. No farewell was spoken. None was needed. They travelled east now, toward the provinces where the Order had always been strongest, where fortresses doubled as churches and names were recorded not for remembrance but for erasure. The heartlands of silence, places where deviation was a sentence and obedience a currency. It was madness, perhaps. But Elias no longer feared madness. He feared forgetting. The road twisted through forests still bare from winter and past villages half swallowed by fog and time. At night, they camped beneath tangled branches or in the abandoned shells of way stations long since reclaimed by ivy and rot. They saw no patrols, no eyes. But Elias knew that didn't mean they weren't being watched. The Order's reach had always been long, but they had become arrogant. And arrogance, he had learned, leaves gaps. On the 5th night, they found a boy. He was no older than 12. thin, mud-covered and barefoot, crouched beside the remains of a collapsed wagon on the roadside. His eyes were wide and feral, and he held a short blade that trembled in his small hands. Lise approached first. She didn't speak. She just knelt and extended her water flask with both hands, fingers open, body still. The boy didn't move. His grip on the blade didn't loosen. But after a long minute, he took the flask. Elias crouched beside them. What happened? The boy didn't answer, but his eyes flicked toward the forest to the dark curve of the trail behind him, and Elias knew. They came through, he said. Didn't they? The boy nodded once, then drank deeply. They camped near the ruins of the wagon, building a small fire beneath a low ridge for shelter. The boy didn't speak for hours, not even his name. He sat close to the heat, eyes darting to every sound. At one point, Elias offered him a strip of dried meat. The boy took it with both hands, scarfing it down too fast. Lise placed a blanket over his shoulders without a word. That night, as the fire dwindled to coals, the boy finally spoke. They took my sister. Elias's breath caught. The voice was so soft it barely existed. She was older, the boy said. They said she had a gift, that she could serve. The man in black gave us coins, said it was an honor. A silence followed. It wasn't the kind that needed to be filled. It was the kind that bore witness. They burned our house after, the boy whispered, said it was part of the rite. I ran. I don't think they cared. Elias stared into the fire. He didn't ask questions. He didn't probe. Instead, he opened his satchel, pulled out his ledger, and turned to a blank page. He handed the boy the quill. Write her name, Elias said. The boy blinked, confused. Elias gestured gently. You don't have to say anything else, just her name, so we remember her. The boy hesitated, then reached out with a shaking hand. He took the quill, dipped it in the ink, and slowly scratched the letters across the parchment. Erin. The ink smeared slightly from his trembling fingers, but it was there, permanent. Lise folded the page and sealed it gently between two others. She'll be remembered, she said. The next morning, the boy woke before them and vanished. No signs, no tracks, just gone. Elias found the blanket neatly folded by the coals. At first, he felt the old ache, the sting of loss, the guilt of not doing more. But then he saw something left behind. A mark, scratched into a flat stone by the fire pit. A spiral, shaky, uneven, but unmistakable. He picked up the stone and placed it in his satchel beside the ledger. That afternoon, they reached the edge of a settlement marked on no map. Stone buildings, a half-standing wall, smoke curling from crooked chimneys, and a church tower still intact, its bell long since broken, now serving as a roost for birds that had forgotten what silence meant. They approached slowly, blending in with the other travellers, pilgrims, traders, workers passing through. No one looked twice. In the town square, a man sold bread from a wooden cart. A child chased a dog through the slush. A woman stood beneath the church steps, handing out pieces of cloth, small squares like tokens. Elias took one. A single spiral stitched in grey thread. He looked up. The woman didn't smile, but her eyes met his with quiet understanding. They passed through, she said softly. Last season. 2 of them, one with silver hair, one with a limp. They left stories, questions, a map. Elias nodded. Lise stepped beside him. The woman continued. They said others would follow, that we'd know them by the way they listened. Elias tucked the cloth into his coat, and for the first time in years he felt something strange rising in his chest. Hope. Not loud, not triumphant, but steady. Certain, like a name etched into stone or a candle lit underground. They stayed one night. Before leaving, Elias pinned a slip of parchment to the inner wall of the church, behind a loose stone. A name, a story, a reminder. The map grew thicker with paths, the ledger heavier with ink. The silence around them became less suffocating, more sacred. They were no longer just surviving. They were building. One name at a time. Spring came like a whisper, not with fanfare or warmth, but with the subtle shift of air against skin, the loosening of frost on tree roots, the scent of thawed earth beneath boots. Elias noticed it first in the sound of the streams, no longer still and silent, but trickling again, speaking in hushed voices that ran parallel to their path. They travelled with caution, as always, but the road no longer felt like exile. It felt like intent. Each village, each ruin, each mile was a thread in something larger than themselves, a quiet web spun across the forgotten edges of the realm, binding memory, resistance, and renewal together in patterns too subtle for the order to see. Lys had begun keeping her own journal. Not like Elias's ledger of names, but something different. Descriptions, maps, details about the people they met, observations of guard patterns in cities they passed, order agents in disguise, whispers overheard in taverns. She wasn't just watching the world anymore, she was cataloguing it. "We need to know what we're walking through," she told Elias one night as they camped beneath the roots of a fallen yew. "The Order doesn't just silence people, it rewrites the world around them." Elias had nodded, understanding more than she likely knew. He had seen it happen. In the border town of Estrelle, they found the proof. It was a clean village, too clean. Streets swept, windows uniform, children silent. No laughter, no song. A chapel at the centre of the square bore the sigil of Saint Cierdan, a saint of judgment often invoked by inquisitors. But the iconography had changed. The spiral once used by those who remembered was now carved beneath the saint's feet, not as reverence but as condemnation. Lee stood before the carving, her jaw tight. "They've turned it into a warning," she said, "twisted it." Inside the chapel, they found more. A ledger, open on the altar. Not names of the faithful, but names of the condemned. Each marked with a date, each accompanied by a single phrase, reconciled. Elias knew the meaning too well. The Order had passed through Estrelle, but not as hunters, as cleansers. He turned the pages slowly. Half the town was listed. Some entries had been crossed out, others circled. He found one that made his breath catch. Therin. No surname, no role, just the name. And beside it, circled twice, known associate, unreconciled. It was the same name from the letter he found months ago beneath the granary floor. The same name tied to the mill that burned. A child then, someone who remembered, even when the world had told him not to. He had survived. Somehow he had kept walking, and the Order had not forgotten. Elias copied the entry into his ledger. He drew the symbol beside it, a spiral surrounded by thorns. "What does it mean?" Lys asked. "It means he's still out there," Elias replied. "And they're still hunting him." They didn't stay in Estrelle. Too many eyes, too much order. But they left something behind. At the edge of the village, hidden beneath the wellstone, Elias tucked a piece of parchment sealed in wax, a message written in code. Not meant for the villagers, meant for the next traveller, the next listener. A warning and a direction. They moved on. For days, the road curved along old riverbeds and collapsed bridges. They passed 2 cities under heavy watch, where Order banners hung from gatehouses and questions outnumbered greetings. In those places they wore new faces, traders, scribes, pilgrims seeking absolution, always one step ahead, always listening. Then, in the southern reaches of the Greenwood Vale, they heard a name, whispered by a tavern boy sweeping floors, tucked into a conversation between 2 beggars beneath a city gate, drawn in chalk on the underside of a merchant's cart. Therin. Always the same spelling, always paired with one word, north. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They turned toward the northern passes the next morning. The forest thickened, pines gave way to towering oaks, and the sky narrowed above them. Moss grew heavier on the stones. Birds returned to the trees, their song a contrast to the silence they carried. One night they found a campfire already lit. It was small, carefully made, built in a ring of river stones with no footprints nearby. No recent ones, at least, but someone had been there and left something behind on purpose. Elias saw it first, a strip of cloth tied to a low branch above the fire. He approached it cautiously, dark blue, frayed at one end, and stitched into it with a crude hand, nearly childlike, was a single spiral but backward, reversed. Elias joined him, her brows drawn tight. "It's a mirror," she said softly, "a signal." Elias examined the knot. Whoever tied it knew the old ways. "This wasn't left by the Order," he said. "This was left by someone watching them. A scout, a defector, or perhaps Therin." They followed the trail, such as it was. Not tracks, but signs. A bent reed here, a notch in a tree there. Nothing obvious. All meant to vanish when viewed too directly. It led them to a glen, sunlit, quiet, impossibly still. And in the centre stood a figure. A young man, late 20s perhaps, with eyes too old for his face and a blade strapped to his back. Not for show, but balance. His cloak was threadbare, his boots muddy, but when he saw them, he didn't draw. He raised one hand, palm out, fingers spread, the signal of memory. Elias mirrored it. The man smiled. "You're late," he said. "They've been hunting me for weeks." Lys stepped forward. "Are you Therin?" and you're the ones leaving names in stone." Elias's throat tightened. "You saw them?" "All of them," Theron said, "and more." He reached into his pack and drew out a rolled parchment, covered in ink marked with circles and paths. "A map?" Elias asked. Theron shook his head. "A network," he said. "They think we're scattered." He looked up. "We're not." And for the first time, Elias understood. What they were building wasn't just memory. It was resistance. Theron spread the map out across a flat stone, weighing down the corners with smooth river pebbles. The parchment was worn, the ink faded in places, but the markings were unmistakable. Circles, spirals, arrows, and small notations in a language that Elias only partially recognized. It wasn't a typical map. No coastlines, no mountain ranges or rivers. It didn't chart land. It charted people. Safe houses, caches, names, dates. "I started it 5 years ago," Theron said, crouching low, tracing one calloused finger across the ink. "Back when I realized no one was going to come looking for us, that no one could, not unless someone left a trail worth following." He glanced at Elias, eyes sharp but not unkind. "So I became the trail." Elias knelt beside him, scanning the parchment with practiced eyes. "This one," she said, pointing to a symbol near the lower edge. "We passed through here last month, the village with the leaning chapel." Theron nodded. "They remember, quietly. 2 of their elders once served the order. Long ago, they buried their marks under the altar stone. I left a story behind." Elias felt a slow, heavy pull in his chest. Not fear, something deeper. The dawning weight of scale, of understanding just how far this had spread beneath the surface. "You've done all this alone?" Theron gave a small, tired smile. "Not alone, just separate. There are others. Messengers, scribes, map walkers. We don't meet often. Too dangerous. But when we do, we update the map." Elias leaned forward. "You said they've been hunting you. How close?" Theron exhaled. "Close enough. They know someone's leaving messages. They haven't seen me directly, but they've tightened the noose. Patrols on every trade road. Blades that don't speak. Priors sent with disguised inquisitors." He paused, then added, "They've adapted." Elias nodded grimly. "They always do." Theron rolled up the map again, tying it with a thin strip of waxed cloth. "Which is why we can't stay still, not anymore." A silence followed. Then Elias said, "We're ready." Theron met his gaze. "Ready for what?" "To stop hiding," Elias said, "to make this bigger." Lise looked at them both. "If the Order's adapting, so must we. Scattered memory isn't enough. It has to be organized, preserved, and defended." Theron's expression changed, just slightly, a flicker of something that resembled cautious hope. "We've talked about it," he said. "The others? A central hub, not just for record-keeping, for strategy, communication, training, something to unite all these broken threads." "Where?" Elias asked. Theron hesitated. "There's an old ruin in the deep north, a stronghold before the Order fractured, long since abandoned. The terrain's harsh, winter clings to it year-round, but it's secluded, forgotten." "We can reach it," Lise said. "It's not just reaching it," Theron warned. "It's holding it. Once we gather there, we'll be more visible. The Order will sense movement. They'll strike." Elias felt the cold wind brush his face. Above them, grey clouds rolled slowly across the sky, thick with the threat of late snow. He turned to Lise. She gave the faintest nod. Then to Theron. "Then let them strike," Elias said. "We're not shadows anymore." Theron said nothing for a moment. Then he pulled from his satchel a sealed scroll, waxed, bound, marked with a faded spiral half covered in soot. "This is the location," he said. "There's a code embedded in the margins, phrases only the old scribes would know. If intercepted, they won't understand it." Elias accepted the scroll, tucking it beneath his cloak. "We'll leave tonight," Lise said. "No," Theron said. "You'll leave now." They turned. He pointed to the slope above the glen, to a tree line just beyond the ridge. "There's a scout, an Order one. I saw his tracks this morning. He hasn't moved yet, but he's watching, waiting." "How many?" Elias asked. "1, maybe 2 more behind him, enough to mark your presence." Theron stood, wrapping his cloak tighter. "I'll lead them away. Draw them east. You'll head northwest. The longer they chase me, the more time you'll have." "You'll be exposed," Lise said. Theron smiled faintly. "It's not the first time." He reached into his pouch and pulled out a small disc of wood, roughly carved and worn at the edges, a spiral etched into one side. He pressed it into Elias's hand. "If you reach the stronghold," Theron said, "light a beacon, a real one. Let them see it. Let them wonder. Let them fear what's still alive. Elias gripped the token tightly. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Theron turned and vanished into the trees, silent as falling snow. They didn't wait to watch him go. They were already moving, northwest, through briar and root, past frost-hardened soil and wind-hollowed ridges. The forest thickened again, then thinned. The terrain climbed, then dipped, and always the sky above them stretched pale and distant like parchment waiting for ink. Each step carried the weight of something new. Not just memory, not just resistance, but awakening. By nightfall they were miles away, and behind them, far to the east, Elias thought he saw a flicker of movement. Not fire, not lightning, but something chasing light. Snow returned that night, not in sheets, not in blinding fury, but in thin, drifting flakes that whispered through the branches and settled on cloaks and shoulders like a warning. Elias and Lise pressed on, guided not by stars which were hidden behind thick clouds, but by the contours of the land and the worn memory of ancient travel paths marked only in the minds of those who remembered. The northern reaches were cruel, quiet and vast. The trees grew farther apart here, their twisted limbs bare as skeletal fingers, reaching toward a sky that never fully lightened. By the second day, they had passed beyond the edge of any known settlement. No fires burned in the distance, no smoke rose, no birds sang, only the crunch of snow beneath their boots and the wind whistling low through the hills. They moved by instinct now, trusting the markings hidden in the scroll Theron had given them, a language few still read, composed of placement, margin, pressure. Not obvious directions, but patterns. The same way the old chroniclers used to embed truths beneath sermons and ritual. Elias studied the map by firelight each night, using the old monk's cipher Malin had taught him. There were lines within lines, warnings masked as prayers. Phrases like, where the northward wind hums against stone, and beneath the crag shaped like a knife. Each one pointed to landmarks not shown but felt. They found the crag on the fourth day. It jutted out of the ridgeline like the snapped tip of a buried blade, black against the snow. The wind howled around it, just as the scroll had promised. There, beneath its shadow, they found the path. A narrow ravine, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look, choked with brambles, overgrown with frost-laced thistle, but walkable. The walls rose high on either side, curved inward to block wind and sight alike. It led them deeper, into silence so dense it felt physical. Here, time bent. The world narrowed to breath, frost and rhythm. Hours passed without measure. Shadows crawled slowly across stone. The air grew thinner, the cold sharpened. And then, at last, they saw it. Half buried in the cliffside, obscured by snowdrifts and jagged rock, the stronghold revealed itself not in grandeur, but in stillness. An archway, once tall and proud, now cracked at the peak, moss growing from its joints. Stone steps descending beneath the earth, partially collapsed but intact. The remains of a banner, faded to grey, but once deep blue, still clung to a rusted iron bracket. Lise stood at the threshold, her breath visible, her eyes narrow. No tracks, she murmured. No smoke, no scent of life. Elias stepped beside her, resting a hand against the cold stone. They haven't come back. He lit a torch. Together they descended. The steps groaned beneath them, but held. The air changed, damp and mineral-rich, with a faint sweetness beneath the mildew. It was the scent of age, of dust that had waited. The passage opened into a wide chamber, empty, silent, but whole. Stone columns rose on either side, carved with spirals and sunbursts now worn smooth by time. Empty torch brackets lined the walls. At the centre stood a dais, round, cracked at the edge, with a shallow basin set into its middle. Ash long cooled lay at the bottom. Elias approached. This was a beacon, he said. A real one. Lise knelt beside the dais, brushing away snow that had drifted in through cracks in the ceiling. Then this was never just a watch post, she said. This was meant to call others. Elias lit another torch and began to explore the perimeter. Doorways led to smaller rooms, barracks, kitchens, a library whose shelves had mostly rotted. But in one sealed chamber, behind a door nearly frozen shut, they found a storeroom untouched by decay. Inside, wax-sealed crates, bundles of parchment wrapped in oilcloth, a wall of weapons so old their blades had turned the colour of bone. Not weapons of war, symbols, each one marked, not with the order's sigils, but spirals, reversed, doubled, some cut with lines through them like compass points, the forgotten signs of factions that had once walked away. Scribes, exiles, map-walkers, the silent ember, the circle without name. This was a sanctuary, Elias whispered, but not just a place to hide. He turned to Lys. This was meant to begin. They spent 3 days clearing the space, repairing collapsed beams, burning out mildew with slow fires, boiling snow for water, mapping entrances and escape paths. They took inventory of every object, every wall etching, every fragment of parchment. They moved slowly, deliberately. On the third night, beneath a sky scraped clean of cloud, they lit the beacon. The basin in the dais burned low but steady, fed by the stored oils they had found and protected by stone lips that funneled the smoke into an old chimney above. From outside, the light was barely visible, but to those who knew, who remembered, the spiral flame would be unmistakable. A call, not a shout, a murmur carried by wind and silence alike. Elias sat near the flame, his ledger in his lap, the names within illuminated by the soft flicker of firelight. He added 2 more that night, Therin and the boy in the woods. He wrote no details, only that they had remembered. Lys came to sit beside him, her eyes on the light rising above them. "How long do you think before someone comes?" she asked. Elias closed the book. "They're already on their way." She looked at him. "You're sure?" He nodded quietly. "Because remembering is louder than fire." The first to arrive came on the 7th night. A woman, cloaked in storm-worn wool, her boots caked in ice and her hands wrapped in cloth that bore the faint scent of pine sap and oil. She said nothing as she stepped across the threshold of the stronghold, eyes sweeping every shadow, every beam, every stone in silence. She removed her hood, revealing weathered skin and a face drawn not from age, but from time spent beyond language. She did not speak her name. She simply walked to the beacon, still burning low in the center of the hall, and drew from her satchel a small object, a coin blackened by fire, its markings long since melted smooth. She placed it at the foot of the dais, knelt briefly, then turned and joined the shadows along the wall. An hour later, 2 more arrived. A man and a girl, father and daughter perhaps, one limping slightly, the other with hair cropped short like a novice acolyte. They bore no weapons, only tools. A roll of canvas filled with chisels, fine-tipped quills, a sealing iron. From the hills came another, a courier with fingers ink-stained and sleepless eyes carrying a pouch heavy with sealed messages. He did not stay long, but he knelt as the others did, then departed through the northern arch, leaving behind only a folded map marked with red thread at its corners. By morning, the chamber held 9. By the end of the next week, there were 16. Not soldiers, not rebels, remnants. And they did not come to fight. They came to record. The stronghold, long silent, now breathed again. The chambers filled with the shuffle of parchment, the scratch of writing, the murmured recitation of names that had nearly disappeared into dust. A woman who once served as a chronicler for the High Table now worked by candlelight, recreating the erased annals of the Lost 13, agents who had vanished in one winter, blamed for treason, but remembered by whispers. A former architect began restoring a half-collapsed corridor, his chalk markings spreading along the floor like veins. A child, no older than 10, memorized the placement of the entry tunnels and could repeat every twist in perfect order. It was not a rebellion, not yet. It was something older, something quieter, a foundation. Lys took to the outer ridges during the day, mapping the surrounding land with care. Water sources, cover routes, high ground. She taught the new arrivals how to walk silently across stone, how to listen for the unnatural hush of a waiting blade. Not to prepare for war, but to survive it. Elias worked in the scriptorium. He reorganized the ledgers, catalogued the fragments, wrote out every known cipher from memory, comparing it with those brought by the others. He matched threads, found patterns, cross-referenced lists of names he had recorded with the ones that now poured in daily. And slowly, a shape began to form, not a single revelation, not a moment of discovery, but pattern. The Order had hunted in cycles, waves that moved through the outer provinces in consistent intervals. 3 months of silence, followed by a flare of disappearances, not random, controlled, focused on places where rumours bloomed. They weren't erasing at whim. They were pruning, preserving their power not through destruction, but through curation, choosing what truths could be remembered there and when. Elias brought this to Lais one evening, unfurling the parchment across the cold surface of the war table, now covered in soot and ash marks. "They're not chasing noise," he said. "They're chasing resonance." She studied the points he marked, every recorded erasure, every coordinated vanishing. "You think they're afraid of what comes when memory is connected. I think they know what happens when people realize they're not alone." Lais straightened. "Then it's not just about lighting beacons anymore." "No," Elias said. "It's about knitting them together." They began to send runners, one by one, carefully chosen and equipped with encrypted routes, paths leading from stronghold to contact, contact to sanctuary, sanctuary to quiet city corners where forgotten names were spoken still. Each runner carried a small token, a carved spiral etched with a central dot. Those who received it would know the stronghold was real, the memory was alive, and they were not the last. In the chamber of flame, now called the Circle Hall, the number of arrivals grew. A sculptor offered her hands to carve the names into stone. A blind man recited every missing record of the council cities from memory, pausing only to drink from the melted snow Lys brought him. A group of monks brought their songs, low, ancient things, sung not to invoke faith, but preserve it. There was no leader. No one gave orders. Each person simply knew their part. And Elias, who once wore a name that was never his, now walked the corridors not as a shadow, not as a tool, but as a bearer of memory. He no longer feared his past. He wrote it. He read it aloud. He taught it. One night, as the winds howled across the high ridge and snow rose in soft swells around the beacon shaft, a child placed her hand on the cold stone beside the flame. She looked up at Elias, who sat with his ledger open. "Do we tell the names of the ones who hurt us?" she asked. He met her eyes, and after a long pause he said, "Yes," she frowned. "Why?" "Because forgetting them lets them shape the story." He turned the page, and this time the story is ours. Spring died quietly in the north. Its presence had been fleeting, little more than a suggestion of warmth, a few stubborn shoots of green breaking through thawed earth before retreating again beneath the weight of cold wind and cloud. By the time the snow began to fall once more, thick and purposeful, the stronghold had become something else entirely. It was no longer a ruin, it was a pulse. Stone corridors once hollow now thrummed with quiet industry. Fires burned in every chamber. The halls echoed with footsteps, voices, the clink of tools against stone, the hush of old stories spoken aloud for the first time in years. Rooms that had collapsed into silence now held libraries, workshops, sleeping quarters. Every inch of the place bore a mark of memory. Elias watched it happen not with the pride of a builder, but with the awe of someone who had once believed such a thing impossible. He had lived in shadows for so long. He had forgotten what it meant to witness. But now he bore witness every day, to survival, to return, to the slow unbreaking of a world thought lost. The stonecutter, whose hands shook when she arrived, now carved names into the east wall with unerring precision. Hundreds of names, some short and sharp, others long, foreign, like breath drawn over winter frost. Each etched deeply, blackened with soot to preserve their lines against time. Children, too young to remember the order, were being taught the old maps, not just routes, but the meaning of them. Where the order had come, where it had cleansed, where it had failed. Their teachers used stones and ash, drawing spiral paths that looped through valleys and silence, anchoring history not in parchment but in place. Lys led patrols now. She never called them that. She called them walkers. Pairs who moved through the land like wind and root, never lingering, never fighting unless cornered. Their task was not to attack. It was to find the forgotten, the scattered, the ones who still believed they were alone, and bring them back. Elias's role had changed as well. His ledger had grown too thick for his own hands. The pages, stitched, reinforced, and duplicated by scribes, had been copied dozens of times now. Each copy sealed, coded, and sent outward with runners to hidden caches, sanctuaries, places where memory could be preserved even if the stronghold fell. But it wouldn't fall. Not easily. Not now. Because the Order, for all its reach, had made one fatal mistake. It had believed that burning a name erased it. Elias proved otherwise every day. He had begun writing not just names now, but stories, full stories, the kind the Order had once sliced into fragments and buried in half-truths. He wrote of Mireille, the healer, his mother, whose memory he had once held in dream alone. He wrote of Gregor of Lüneburg, the merchant who had died with no one to speak for him. Of Ash, who had wept through walls. Of Arlen, whose blade trembled even in loyalty. Of the mill in the forest. Of Doltherin. And of the monastery with the spiral in the stone. One evening, while Elias sat in the scriptorium drafting a new record, Lys entered without knocking. Her hair was dusted with snow, her eyes unreadable. He looked up, immediately alert. She said one word. Ravens, he stood. How many? 5. Travelling light. No visible marks. But the gait, efficient, measured, and one of them had the pause. You know the one. He did. It was the way assassins moved when choosing where to step before entering a room. Not out of caution, but from instinct. They were trained, and they were close. How far? Elias asked. A day, maybe less. He said nothing, just closed the book and set it aside. He wasn't afraid. He was ready. They gathered that night. Not the entire stronghold, too many, too scattered across their work, but the 34 who had weapons and memory sharpened by time. A small circle. No uniforms, no banners, only knowledge. Elias stood before them in the circle hall. The flame still burned in the beacon, low, steady. He looked at them, faces marked by history, not hatred. People who had survived not because they sought violence, but because they carried truth. This is not a siege, he said. This is not a war. His voice was calm. If they come to bury us, to write silence over what we've remembered. But we are not ghosts, not anymore. He paused, scanning the room. And if we are remembered, truly remembered, they can't win. He stepped down from the daïs, unsheathed the blade he had once buried after his final kill, and laid it across the stone floor. Not as an offering, as a line. Lys did the same. One by one, so did the others. No ceremony, no speeches, only presence. Then the preparations began, quietly, methodically. Those who could not fight were guided to the tunnels that wove deep beneath the mountain, past the reservoir chambers and out toward the forest. Not to flee, to preserve. Each carried pages, names, copies of the records Elias had written. Not a retreat, a dispersion. The names would live on. By dawn, the sky had turned copper with stormlight. The wind cut sharper across the ridge. The beacon was extinguished, not in fear, but in discipline. And on the ledge above the stronghold, 4 figures emerged, draped in grey, faces covered, movements smooth and patient. Elias stood at the gate, unmoving, waiting. He did not wear armour, he did not draw his weapon, he simply spoke. I know why you came. The first figure stepped forward, a woman by her frame. Her hand hovered near her hip, but she did not draw. We are here to correct what was broken, she said. Elias nodded. So am I. The wind screamed between them, a pause. Then the woman said, you were trained to forget. And I chose to remember. They stared at each other, and in that silence, something ancient began to shift. Because this battle, if it came, was not between blade and blade. It was between silence and story. And Elias had become a story the Order could no longer bury. The stillness that followed was so complete it felt unnatural, thick with the weight of unspoken years. The woman stood no more than 10 paces from Elias. Snow gathered slowly on her cloak, her hood casting a long shadow over her face. Behind her, the other 4 assassins fanned out, not with the urgency of an attack, but the precision of containment. Each positioned to cut off an escape route should it come to that. Elias remained exactly where he stood. He did not draw his blade. He did not flinch. The woman tilted her head slightly, as if measuring him. You shouldn't remember, she said at last. Her voice was cool, quiet, controlled. You weren't meant to. I wasn't meant to live either, Elias replied. That drew the faintest flicker of a reaction. Her breath caught just slightly. Then stillness again. Behind him the stronghold waited, silent, watching. The woman stepped forward. I read your name in the Raven reports, number 6112. Her eyes narrowed. You were called back after the Lüneburg mission. He nodded, and I kept going. She studied him. Why? Elias didn't answer immediately. He reached slowly into his satchel, not for a weapon, but for a small leather book, his ledger, the one he had carried since the first name clawed its way back into his hands. He opened it, thumbed through its worn pages, then held it out toward her. These are the people I killed, he said. Their names, their truths, everything the Order erased. She didn't take the book, but she didn't move away. You were trained to be efficient, she said, to be clean, silent. I was, Elias replied, and I was very good at it. Silence again. She stepped closer. He didn't back away. And now you build sanctuaries, she said, a trace of something colder in her voice. You leave signals, you gather dissent, you spread false records. They're not false, he said, voice flat. Memory is a liability, she said sharply. It clouds judgment, it weakens the edge. No, Elias said, his voice rising just slightly. It's what makes us human. Her eyes narrowed again. You were never meant to be human. For the first time, Elias stepped forward, just once. A single pace. But I was, he said. We all were. Before the Order hollowed us out and taught us to mistake silence for strength. Behind the woman, one of the others shifted, barely noticeable, but there. A flicker of hesitation. Lais emerged then from the stronghold's main entrance. Her blade was sheathed, but her posture was firm. She stood beside Elias, her presence solid and unshaken. We don't want to fight, she said, addressing all 5 of them. But we will, if we have to. The woman in grey looked from Elias to Lise, then past them to the dark entrance behind, to the shadowed shapes moving within, the outline of shelves, of scriptoriums, of children learning names. And something changed in her eyes. A fracture, not visible to most, but Elias saw it. Because it was the same fracture that had begun in him all those years ago, quiet, slow, fatal to the obedience it once protected. You believe, she said, voice distant, that what you've built will last? Elias answered without looking away. No, he said, but I believe someone will carry it when it falls. Another silence, a longer one. Then slowly she reached up and pulled back her hood, a pale face, cold-bitten, marked beneath the eyes by fatigue that ran deeper than muscle. She turned to her companions. 3 stood still. The 4th, a tall man with grey at his temples, glanced at her, then stepped back half a pace. A break in formation. The woman turned back to Elias. If we don't report, they'll send more. I know. And if we do report, they'll still come. I know that too. She stared at him, then looked again at the ledger in his hand. May I see it? She asked quietly. He hesitated, then held it out again. This time, she took it. She opened the first page, ran her fingers down the inked names. When she reached the page with Gregor of Lüneburg, her hand paused. You remember them all? She asked. I try to, Elias said. She closed the book slowly. Then, in one fluid motion, she turned, walked back to her companions and placed the ledger in the tall man's hands. Deliver this, she said. He blinked. To the table? No, she replied. To the scribes in the outer circle, to the ones still asking questions. Let them read. He looked at her, uncertain, but after a moment he nodded, tucked the book into his cloak and began down the slope, footsteps soft in the snow. The woman turned back to Elias. Her hand hovered near her blade, but did not draw it. Don't mistake this for peace, she said. I don't. It's only pause. I know, but it's a beginning. And for the first time she allowed a breath, half a laugh almost. May the memory outlast us all, she said. Then she and the remaining assassins turned and faded into the trees. Lais exhaled. Elias stood still, watching the last figure disappear into the woodline. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He just listened. To the wind, to the silence, to the beat of something deeper than both. Not victory, not yet. But the echo of a page turning, and the sound of the next one waiting. The snow had stopped by morning. The wind, once biting, had fallen to a low hush that threaded softly through the pine and across the outer ledges of the stronghold. For the first time in days, the light came through without being diffused by cloud or ice, clear, blue-grey, and sharp enough to cast long shadows through the arches. Elias stood alone on the upper walkway, watching the trail disappear into the hills where the Order's emissaries had vanished hours earlier. His breath clouded in the air. His hands were raw and chapped from days without gloves, but he didn't notice the cold. He was still thinking about what she'd said. It's only pause. She had meant it as a warning, a reprieve, not a surrender. Elias knew that. He could still feel the tension in her voice, the restraint in her fingers as they'd hovered near her blade. The Order wasn't finished. Not yet, not even close. But something had shifted. He had handed her the ledger expecting silence or violence. Instead, he had seen a choice being made, one she likely hadn't known she would make until the moment the name Gregor passed beneath her thumb. That was the power of remembrance. It didn't command, it called. And sometimes that call was enough. Footsteps approached behind him. Light, familiar, Lise. She stopped beside him and followed his gaze toward the ridge. "They won't come back the same way," she said. "I know. They'll send ones with colder hearts next time. I know that too." Lise folded her arms. "But they'll also be slower now, suspicious, conflicted." Elias didn't answer right away. Then he said, "It was never going to be clean." She gave a dry laugh. "Nothing ever is." They stood in silence a moment longer. Then she said, "The scribes are asking for you. The library's reorganized. They want to begin formalizing the archive." Elias nodded. He didn't move yet. She didn't press. Below them, the stronghold stirred. Children were sweeping the lower walkways. 2 runners were preparing for departure, packs already fastened, cloaks drawn. A scribe sat cross-legged on the stones, transcribing oral accounts from a woman who had fled the southern barracks with only a shard of glass and a name carved into her palm. Each detail mattered now. Every word. Because if the Order's war was one of silence, then their only weapon would always be story. "I've been thinking," Elias said, "about the old structure of the Order, not the high table, but before that, the early years when the roles were still fluid, when silence was used to protect, not erase." Lise looked at him. "You want to restore it?" "Not restore," he said. "Reimagine it. Something new, something drawn from memory, not from hierarchy." He paused, then added, "We've been collecting stories, names, places, but we haven't defined what it means to hold them, what it means to guard memory. What it demands." Lise nodded slowly. "You're talking about a vow." "A new one," Elias said. "Not sworn in blood, not in secrecy, but in choice." He turned to face her. "I want to ask them, all of them, to choose whether they carry this burden, whether they want to be part of a lineage that doesn't kill in silence but remembers in defiance." She met his gaze. "You think they're ready?" "I think they're already doing it," he said, "but we need to give it shape." That evening, a circle was formed. Not the council of the high table, not a war room, just a gathering. 54 people, from all across the Reach, some who had wandered from ruined keeps, others born in hiding, and still others who had once worn the very colours they now resisted. No thrones, no titles, only presence. Elias stood in the centre of the circle hall. The flame burned low behind him. Not a beacon this time, but a lantern. A symbol of careful light. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't command. He invited. "I've asked you here," he said, "not to lead you, not to promise safety, but to offer a vow." He held up the ledger. "This began as a confession, as proof that I once served a lie. But now it's something else. It's a record, a resistance, a history that no longer belongs to me alone." He stepped forward. "If you wish, you may leave this place and continue to remember in silence. We will never hunt you, never shame you. You carry memory in your own way." He paused. "But if you wish to stay, if you wish to carry the stories of the lost, if you wish to be part of a chain of memory that the Order cannot sever, then I ask you to step forward, not as warriors, not as scribes, but as keepers." No one moved at first. Then a girl, no older than 16, stepped forward and placed her hand on the stone before Elias. "I will carry what they forgot," she said. A second followed. Then a third. Then a wave. By nightfall, 27 had stepped into the centre. Not all, but enough. They were the beginning of something new. The next morning they took their first vow, to remember without vengeance, to carry names, not blades, to speak what was once silenced, to preserve, not possess, to be, in all things, the memory that endures. They called themselves the Chain. Not a rebellion, not a religion, a relay of remembrance. Elias etched the first line of their vow into the western wall of the stronghold, beside the names already carved. Lise placed a hand on his shoulder when he finished. "They'll come for us again," she said. "I know." She smiled faintly. "But this time, we'll be harder to erase." The storm arrived on the 10th night after the vow. Not a storm of snow or sleet, but something older, heavier. The kind of silence that settled before calamity, when even the crows left the branches and the dogs refused to bark. It crept in on the wind, slow and cold, pressing against the stronghold's walls like a memory trying to break through. Elias felt it first. He stood in the upper library when it came, a slight tremor beneath his boots, a sound at the edge of hearing, too low to name but impossible to ignore, a pressure behind the ribs like breath held too long. He closed the ledger. He didn't have to speak. By now the others knew. They moved in silence. Not panic, not fear, but readiness. Lys met him in the corridor leading toward the circle hall. She already had her short blade strapped to her back and a coil of signal cloth tucked into her satchel. Her expression was calm but sharp, sharper than he'd seen since the first months of escape. "They're here," she said. Elias nodded. "South Ridge. Smoke, no fire. Scouts say 5 banners." He paused. "Order?" "No insignia, but too clean to be raiders, too still to be local." She handed him a small piece of cloth. On it, someone had drawn a map, hand-sketched, urgent. Markings along the cliff edge, X's near the stream bed. "They've found the old passage," she said. Of course they had. Elias looked at her. "We can't defend the stronghold, not like they expect." Lys didn't blink. "I know, and we can't afford to lose what's inside." "Then we don't." The chain. Those who had taken the vow were already preparing the dispersal. It had become routine, almost quiet. No one rushed. They knew their roles. Scrolls were being sealed in waxcloth and buried in the archive vaults. Ledgers copied and carried by runners who had trained with cold breath in their lungs and blisters in their boots. Children were being moved not to hide, but to preserve. Not as victims, but as vessels. Elias stood once more before the flame in the circle hall. It was not the same beacon as before. This one had been reworked, its basin widened, its oils prepared in secret. When lit, it would not burn with orange or red. It would burn blue, a colour the Order would understand, not surrender. But warning. He lit it with his own hands. As the fire caught, a soft blue glow filled the chamber, casting ghostlight along the stone walls. Shadows flickered, then settled. A hush fell across the hall, not fear but reverence. Elias turned. The members of the chain stood before him, hooded, cloaked, silent. He raised his voice only enough to be heard. "We are not built to fight them," he said, "not on their terms, but we are built to outlast." He lifted a scroll. "This is our weapon. This is our answer, not a blade, a record, a name." He stepped forward, handing it to the youngest among them, a boy named Wren, who had arrived months ago with no past and a tattooed cipher across his ribs. "Take this north," Elias said, "to the ruins of Sethel. There's an old vault beneath the bell tower. Hide it there." Wren nodded, eyes wide, and disappeared into the northern tunnel. One by one, others followed, each given a name, a record, a message. No one protested. They understood, because this was what they'd trained for. By nightfall, the stronghold was half empty, but it did not feel hollow. It felt ready. The wind had changed. It howled now through the ridge stones, rattling shutters and pulling at cloaks like the breath of a dying god. Elias stood atop the outer wall, cloak billowing, watching shapes emerge on the horizon. They moved slowly, deliberately, too organized to be anything but the Order. 5 columns, no torches, no drums, just the rhythm of trained silence. He saw them pause at the cliff's edge, where the trail narrowed. They had found the old path, but they had not yet found him. Behind him, Lys spoke. "They won't burn this place," she said. Elias looked back. "No," he said, "they'll try to erase it." She met his gaze. "They'll fail." The chain had dispersed into the trees, the mountains, the bones of old cities and deeper ruins, but they would return, because the stronghold had never been a single place. It was everywhere. A name had once been spoken and remembered. Every ledger hidden. Every truth kept alive by breath and pen. The Order could come. They could cut down walls and scorch stone, but they could not silence what had already been spoken into so many hearts. That night, Elias returned to the library. He wrote only one name. No story, no notes, just a name, Usher, and below it a single word, approaching. Then he stood, drew the blade he had once sworn never to use again, and walked slowly toward the outer gate, where the storm finally met the flame. The gate stood open, not wide, not in welcome, but just enough to let the wind thread through the stone, to carry the sound of the approaching footsteps inward like a whisper. The fire in the beacon basin still burned, blue and low, its smoke curling into the sky like a ribbon of defiance. Elias stood before it, blade drawn but held low, not raised, not threatening, just present. On the ridge beyond, the Order's agents came into view. They wore no colours, no flags. Their weapons were sheathed but visible. They walked as Elias once had, silent, measured, precise. But unlike Elias, they walked toward a place built not on silence, but on the resistance to it. And at their front, exactly as he had expected, walked Usher. It was not a name, it was a title, a rank whispered in corners of the old Order, carried like a myth. A man who did not interrogate with words or fire, but with certainty. A man who did not need to command. He only arrived. Tall, angular, and pale as chalk, Usher moved with a kind of unnatural stillness. His boots made no sound on the stone. His cloak didn't stir in the wind. Only his eyes moved slowly, methodically, as he studied the walls, the arches, the quiet fire still burning in the distance. He stopped 10 paces from Elias. They faced each other with no one between them. No guards, no blades raised, only memory. Usher tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly. "You were expected," he said. His voice was unlike any Elias had heard. Not deep, not loud, but cold in the way that water is cold at the bottom of the world. Elias didn't respond. Usher's gaze moved to the fire. "Blue," he said, "a plea for witness." Elias shook his head, a declaration of presence. Usher's mouth twitched at the corner, a movement that might have once been called amusement, long ago. "You think this place matters?" he asked. "That carving names in stone will stop what's coming?" "No," Elias said, "but remembering them makes it harder for you to keep erasing." Usher took a slow step forward. Behind him the other figures remained still. "You have scattered truth like seeds," Usher said, "but seeds are soft, easy to burn." Elias's grip on his blade tightened, but only slightly. "And yet some grow," he replied. Usher studied him a moment longer. Then, almost gently, he said, "You were one of our best." Elias breathed slowly. "I was never yours." Another pause. Then Usher said, "You know I'm not here to kill you." Elias nodded. "Not yet. I'm here to offer correction, stillness, restoration." "To what?" Elias asked. "A world where no one remembers how it got this quiet?" Usher's eyes gleamed with something ancient. "To a world where the truth doesn't drown people in chaos." Elias took a step forward now. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "The truth is chaos," he said. "It shatters things before it heals. That's what you've always been afraid of." Silence followed. Even the wind held its breath. Usher stared at him for a long moment, then turned his back. "You've made your vow," he said, "and we've made ours." He walked back to his line. Elias stood unmoving, the blue fire flickering behind him. Usher raised one gloved hand, not as a signal, but as acknowledgement. "You will fall," he said. Elias nodded. "Maybe." He turned and walked back into the stronghold. The gate closed behind him, not with defiance, not with fear, but with finality. Inside, the air held warmth. The chain had returned. One by one, they emerged from tunnels, from forests, from the bones of cities. They brought back names, fragments, stories. They carried the ledger's weight across frost and flame and placed it back where it belonged. Elias stood at the circle hall once more. The walls were fuller now, covered in carved lines, etched vows, maps that spiraled outward like stars. He looked to Les. She stood beside him. And to the others, young and old, scarred and bright-eyed, keepers of what had nearly been lost, he placed his hand on the stone, not to pray, not to surrender, but to remember. And then quietly they began to speak, one name at a time, until the stronghold echoed not with silence, but with memory, living, breathing, unbroken.